right round. You know what bits go, you know what bits go in which program? It's not the same questions that we had yesterday. You just got to work out which.
Did you find that?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're all ready. Is that right?
Oh, I'm not sure about that.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I declare open this public hearing of the Senate Environment, Communications and the Arts Legislation Committee.
What do we do first?
The committee has set Friday, the 31st of July 2009 as the date by which answers to questions on notice are to be returned. Under Standing Order 26, the committee must take all evidence in public session. This includes answers to questions on notice. Officers and senators are familiar with the rules of the Senate governing estimates hearings. If you need assistance, the Secretariat has copies of the rules. I particularly draw the attention of witnesses to an order of the Senate of the 13th of May 2009 specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised and which I now incorporate in Hansard. Officers called upon for the first time to answer a question should state their full name and position for the Hansard record, and witnesses should speak clearly and into the microphones. Mobile phones should be switched off. I welcome Senator the Honourable Stephen Conroy, Minister for Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy, and Portfolio Officers. Minister, would you like to make an opening statement?
Not at this point, but when we move on to the NBN, I do have a statement.
Thank you. We'll now call officers from the Department in relation to Program 1.2, Telecommunications, Online and Postal Services, and invite questions. And I understand there might be some general questions of the Department as well to start off with. Thank you. Ms Scott, did you wish to make an opening statement at all?
Patricia Scott, Secretary. No, Chair.
Thank you very much, and welcome this morning, Ms Scott.
Thank you.
Senator Birmingham.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, Ms Scott, good morning.
Good morning.
Can I firstly turn, and we touched on this with ACMA last night, to the impact of the Gershon review, quickly, in response to a question on notice number 34. The Department indicated the requirements of the Gershon review in terms of the 7.5% and 2.5% reductions, but didn't indicate any estimates in terms of actual money that would be saved. I'm wondering if, now that the budget process has been proceeded with, you could tell us what is in the budget in terms of savings out of Gershon and any other figures related to Gershon, please.
Senator Abul Rizvi, Deputy Secretary. The question on notice answer that we provided, you're correct, indicated only a percentage at that stage because the precise figuring of the 2.5% savings had not been determined at that time. The savings in respect of the 2.5% have now been determined, and they are specifically for 2009-10 $180,000. The balance of the savings are not yet determined. That's the remaining 5%. I'm sorry?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And so the $200,000 essentially in round figures in terms of page 29 is in for the out years and has been taken out of the funding for the department?
Been taken out of our base funding, yes, that's right, Senator. 180,000 rounds to 200
Yep.
in the budget statements.
But as with ACMA, the other 5% has not yet been budgeted for and taken out of that base funding.
Those figures have not yet been finally determined.
They've not yet been finally determined and they're not reflected in the budget in any way.
That's correct.
Thank you.
If I might just correct that, Senator, they're not reflected in our statements. They may be reflected in finance's statement. I can't comment on that, but they're certainly not reflected in our statements.
Okay. Thank you, Mr Risby. Just turning quickly to number 31, if we can duck back there, which relates to staff training. And if you could advise in each of those areas of training who the responsible provider is, please.
Sorry, Senator.
Sorry, in regards to question on notice number 31 about staff training, could you advise who the responsible provider for the different training programs outlined there is, please?
We'd have to take that on notice, Senator. We can provide that.
Okay, if you could, and I'll follow up with other questions on notice in regards to that, so that we keep things moving quickly today. And now, Minister, do you not like community cabinet meetings?
Doesn't he go? I'm sure you're got your tongue in your cheek when you answer that question. They're a valuable way of keeping the government and the cabinet in touch with the views of Australians.
Just note that between June and September last year there were 4 community cabinet meetings and you appeared to only make one of them.
I think you may find I was possibly overseas. I'm happy to take on notice. I think I was on leave for one. I think I was overseas for one, and I may have had a... Oh, yeah, no, that's right. I think I may have missed one over a family funeral. I'm happy to chase up my records on that for you, but no, I know that I had a reason for not being in attendance for each of them, like the one we just had in Emerald in Victoria. I was speaking at the Fibre to the Home conference in Melbourne on the same evening as that one took place. So I only miss them if I have another obligation or I'm on leave.
Well, it would be understandable if you were happy to... I mean, I'm sure you have good reasons, Minister, but it would be understandable if you were missing the Prime Minister's grandstanding showpieces of the rolling community cabinet in any event. That's all from the general questions. Thank you, Chair.
Right, then we'll go to
Could I just...
general questions.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
look, you mentioned your inability to be at a community cabinet because you might have been overseas, Minister. I thank your department for their reply to our question about the costs of your travel last winter, and appreciate that. I notice it comes to something just over $90,000 for your trip to the US and UK. Could you just confirm you took just one departmental officer and one advisor with you on each leg?
Yes, that is correct. I noted the inability of the author of the article to do maths. No, I had one staffer and one departmental officer with me on each of the legs.
Yeah, I'm pleased to see that. I
Yep.
thought it looked unduly excessive to take two, and I thought you would not indulge yourself in that fashion. No doubt, like me, you're always shocked by the cost of these trips, so I'm not going to regale you on that. But I do notice that your colleague, Mr Tanner, says that we're now going to save lots of money by having video conferencing, and as the Minister for Communications, I'm sure you're really enthusiastic about using video conference facilities rather than travelling. Is this something you enthusiastically agree with Mr Tanner on, and that you see the possibility to reduce the cost of overseas travel by using
There's a whole range of benefits to video conferencing, not just cost. There's obviously greenhouse carbon footprint benefits as well. So where it's possible and appropriate, they're a valuable resource for the government.
Mm-hmm. Have you got any trips planned this winter, Minister?
No.
None planned. If you could let the committee know if that
I
should
did,
change.
as I'm sure you noticed from that photograph of myself shaking hands with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I was overseas briefly a few months ago.
Right.
I think I was in the air and in airport lounges longer than on the ground at Hanover, but that was...
I know, I've been to Hanover. That's a worthwhile trip.
Yes. I don't know
you're
if you
not
got to
planning
meet...
to go
I don't know if you got to meet Governor Schwarzenegger, but I'm sure you're very envious.
He's a great Republican. But,
Not according to the Republicans in California. He was able to regale us on trying to get recalcitrant parliaments to pass his budget. He had much worthy advice. We might fly him in to lock the building down and tell you to bring your toothbrush.
No, the problem in California is actually a surfeit of democracy.
It's a surfeit of Republicans.
I'll tell you who created the mess. I think that's all I had on your travel arrangements. But if you are planning anything in the winter, we'd appreciate
advice
to that effect.
There are no plans.
Okay.
Now, Senator Lundy has some general questions of the department as well, I understand, before we go to 2.1. Are you still on general questions?
Yeah,
oh,
I just wondered if perhaps Ms Scott could just brief the committee on the restructure of the department, which is referred to in the financial review of the 15th of May, a restructure scheduled to take effect from June 1. Would you like to just outline what you have in mind?
Senator, as a result of the significant initiatives the government has announced that we are in the process of delivering on, we are refocusing resources to those major priorities. So we've put the NBN with Spectrum, we've put broadcasting together with the digital switchover, and in line with the program structure established under Operation Sunlight, we've put all of our services together. So it's consistent with the broad approach taken in the PBS. I might get. But
it doesn't reflect what we have here in terms of
in terms
witness
of
list and the breakdown here. This is now history, is it? Effectively.
Well, I'll get James to Cameron to outline how the two work together. Effectively, Sunlight gave us the guidance about how we should think about the three program areas as infrastructure, as broadcasting and digital switchover, and then as services. So actually, I think you'll find that the alignment is closer, not further away from what it was.
James Cameron, First Assistant Secretary, Regional Strategy, Digital Economy and Research Division. As the Secretary pointed out, the organisation, the main line areas of the organisation have been grouped into the three broad groups that reflect the program structure, which is now reflected in the PBS. As you noted, Senator, the new structure takes effect from next Monday, and so we're in the midst of the switchover. So that might explain some of the differences with the witness list for today and the structural organisation.
So can you just tell us who will be, I presume, First Assistant Secretaries will head each of the three, will they?
There are three Deputy Secretaries who lead each of the divisions. Mr. Colin Lyons.
Which ones? Who's the head of which?
Mr. Colin Lyons is the Deputy Secretary for the New Infrastructure Group.
Right.
Mr. Abel Rizvi is the Deputy Secretary for the Digital Economy and Services Group, and Andy Townend is the Deputy Secretary for the Broadcasting and Digital Switchover Group.
Oh, okay. So his role is the Digital Task Force.
Yes, that's right.
He's been expanded in a sense. He keeps that, but with added responsibility.
Adds responsibility for broader media and broadcasting regulation.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. But it is a restructure. It doesn't involve additional staffing. It's just moving within the existing resource base and staffing, is it?
It largely involves 93% of staff either have stay exactly where they were, Senator, or they have a slightly different line of reporting. So, for example, the people that were reporting on broadcasting issues will now report to Andy Townend. A lot of people were reporting to Col Lyons already, but he'd been sort of offline working on National Broadband Network, and I've been looking after some of the shop, and now we'll go back to a normal structure where he'll be looking after more divisions. There are some areas that will be expanding in size. We're going to be doing, obviously, more work on convergence and spectrum over time. And there are some areas where we've identified some potential areas of duplication where we'd like to achieve some efficiencies. And they've been identified, and we're now working to reduce staffing levels in those places, principally through redeployment, but it may either redeployment within the department. Some people are interested in redeployment in other areas of APS, and we may, we will be using voluntary redundancies for some small number of staff. Ultimately, the size of the department increases, but within the total, the numbers are varying a little as a result of new priorities.
Yeah, I note with interest the Australian did quite a good little table of all the departments and their spending on wages and suppliers, and I'm pleased to note that communications currently is the 4th cheapest department. Congratulations on that. But more dramatically, it
only
shows
in cost, not in quality of advice, Minister.
I'm sure that's right,
Senator.
I'm sure that's right, Minister. But there's nearly a 50% drop over the next 3 years, according to this table, which is based on budget figures, from 164 million to 87 million, the second biggest drop over the next 3 years, second only to climate change. I presume that's because your activities associated with the NBN and digital switchover and things like that will, in 3 years' time, you optimistically believe will all be done and you can cut the size of your department by half, eh?
Senator, I'm sure you recall from your days elsewhere that many of the forward estimates of departments show this sort of decline like this, but of course new initiatives emerge over the years. I'm not sure that those figures that you've referenced there are accurate. I think we did a calculation a week or two ago, and I might have it slightly wrong, but I think there was 26% decline in our forward estimates compared to last year of the forward estimates and 08, 09, but an even worse figure could have been derived last year.
Right.
The forward estimates typically look like this, which is why I think there is a conservative bias built into finances numbers because, of course, new initiatives do emerge.
Yeah.
And there were new initiatives this year.
It's quite a dramatic table because virtually every other department is sort of static, but it does show this very substantial drop in comms and climate change. But I will go back and examine the detail of it. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Senator Minchin. Senator Lundy, did you have general questions for the department?
Look, I'll take some guidance from the department. I have some questions about disability access to telecommunication services, and I wasn't sure if they were in general questions or we can move into 1.2 and ask them there.
Chair, the officer is available if you would be comfortable to take them now. We're happy to take them.
That's fine.
Thanks very much. I'd like to start by asking officers for an overview about the government's initiatives to improve access to communication services and technologies for people with disabilities, with particular attention to the specialised equipment to help people with disabilities access telco services.
Thank you, Senator. Keith Besgrove, First Assistant Secretary, Telecommunications Network Regulation and Australia Post Division. Senator, under the Universal Service Obligation, Telstra is obliged to provide appropriate equipment to customers who cannot communicate using normal telecommunications equipment. Telstra must provide this equipment at the same rental rate as it provides standard telephone handsets. It meets its obligations through a process called the Disability Equipment Program. Optus and Primus also maintain a disability equipment program, and in some circumstances other carriers can also use the disability equipment programs that Telstra and others provide to their customers. The eligibility requirements and the decisions on what equipment is provided is actually made by the carriers themselves. So they have an obligation to provide the equipment, but the specific kind of equipment which is made available is left up to the individual carriers themselves. Carriers with a revenue over a prescribed threshold also fund the National Relay Service, which provides text-based services and voice carryover for people who are impaired but able to speak, and hearing carryover for speech-impaired people. Now, the government has recently announced a review of these equipment programs, in part because of some long-standing concerns raised by a range of disability advocacy groups that while the existing program was quite good as far as it went, the choices available to people with disabilities were limited to the 3 carriers who actually had the disability equipment program. So earlier this year at a disability forum in Melbourne, the Minister announced that there would be a review, which the Department is currently conducting. We released a discussion paper and called for submissions on that review. That call for submissions is now closed, and we have, I think from memory, received about 35 submissions. So we're going through the process of looking at the ideas and propositions that have been put forward in those submissions. We've also embarked on a fairly substantial process of consultation around Australia, quite deliberately seeking to get first-hand opinions from disability advocacy groups as well as the carriers themselves and other interested parties, and that consultation process is continuing at the moment.
Is the consultation process related to the feasibility study that I understand the government's undertaken with respect to the disability equipment program, or is that the review? It's essentially the one and the same.
Okay. Sorry, I called it a review. It's also referred to as a feasibility study.
Yeah. One of the issues that's been raised with me is the potential for captioned telephony. Are you familiar with that equipment?
I am, Senator, and that is one of the issues which has been raised. A number of the disability advocacy groups have been seeking a review of this general area for some time, and the terms of reference of the review are reasonably broad in order to endeavour to capture a wide range of perspectives. I should say, going back to the forum which the Minister spoke at, along with his colleague Bill Shorten, in February, there was quite a wide range of groups represented at that gathering, and they were looking at a range of issues to do with accessibility and affordability for the disabled community in general. In an event of that sort, you invariably end up with a very wide range of issues being placed on the table, and the purpose of this review process is to try and get as much of those issues out and try and get some idea of what might be feasible in terms of changes or improvements to the existing arrangements.
So can you provide a list of the different organisations that the department's already met with in the context of this review or feasibility study, or just do you have a list?
Well, I'm happy to table it. Just to touch on a few of them, we've met with a number of different departments, such as the Department of Health and Ageing, the Human Rights Commission, disabled representative groups such as Women with Disabilities, the National Council on Intellectual Disabilities. We've also met with carriers such as Telstra and Optus. Other groups include the Aboriginal Disability Network, Deafness Forum. We've also quite deliberately engaged with industry representative groups such as the Communications Alliance, and the Internet Society of Australia has also been involved. So we're trying to cast the net fairly broadly. One of the things that we find when we look at an issue such as this is that there's a very wide range of stakeholders with at least some opinions, and certainly a number that are directly affected by decisions in this area.
So do you plan to meet with telecommunications companies that don't currently have a disability equipment program?
Yes, we do. We're endeavouring to talk to some of the smaller carriers as well, given that one of the intentions or one of the issues which the disability community has raised is that they would like to see opportunities for greater choice than what is currently available under the existing disability equipment programs offered by the three carriers that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned before that carriers choose which equipment is provided. What role is there potentially for the government to oversee an across-the-board equipment upgrade, given it seems to me that the carriers aren't responding to the needs of consumers in this area with the latest equipment? And I guess I'm making that interpretation given, you know, the position I'm familiar with organisations like the Deafness Forum lobbying hard for caption telephony.
Senator, perhaps I could just touch on the terms of reference. It's looking at the current arrangements, including how equipment is currently accessed, both Australia and overseas, the demand for specialised equipment, and attempting to project what that demand might look like over the next 10 years, the eligibility criteria and the types of equipment, software and other technologies, and then possible organisational and governance models, and the assessment of projected costs of such a program, including outreach activities, and finally options for funding an independent disability equipment program. So we're quite deliberately casting it broadly. I don't really think that I should be speculating as to where this might go, but it is very clear that we'll be looking at a range of measures, including improvements to the existing schemes and whether there's support for alternatives.
Can you tell me whether the various groups representing people with disabilities are going to be part of the new consumer peak organisation, ACAN?
Yes. ACAN, as you're probably aware, is still being formed and will commence formal operations on the 1st of July, but the process of formation of ACAN is well advanced. It has a legal structure, it has a board which has met on 3 occasions now. ACAN recently announced that it had selected a CEO, so the process of forming ACAN is quite well advanced. I'm not actually sure how many groups have expressed interest in joining or affiliating with ACAN, but it is certainly more than 40. So what we're seeing with the development of ACAN is what is already shaping up to be a very significant umbrella advocacy organisation, which is likely to have a much stronger representation across the board than what was the case with its predecessor organisations.
Can you, just on ACAN, I don't know how much you went into this yesterday evening, but I'm interested in the philosophical approach to ACAN and also how much the government has committed to it in budgetary terms.
I think certainly the approach that we've taken in advising the Minister is that the preceding arrangements for consumer and disability representation in Australia, which had operated under the Section 593 grants for the preceding 10 years or so, had been effective up to a point. They'd certainly supported the activities of a number of organisations which had done some very useful work. However, it was quite clear that those efforts were somewhat fragmented, under-resourced, and the Minister quite early supported the idea of developing a much more effective peak body. And so the intention behind forming ACAN is to, first of all, provide a much stronger advocacy voice and a better resourced advocacy voice for consumers and disability groups in Australia in the telecommunications space. We have also quite deliberately emphasised the need for ACAN and its affiliated organisations to rely much more on research in the future. There's certainly been some tendency in the past for these groups to rely on anecdotal evidence and not necessarily to back that up with well-founded research. So a major element of the new entity's role will be to research communications consumer issues in depth. So if you like, the idea is to try and put the consumer and disability groups onto a more equal footing with industry and indeed with government. And the Minister is on record as saying that he doesn't expect them to always agree with him.
So, and the level of resourcing?
The
behind
level of
this initiative?
resourcing has been increased. The previous Section 593 grants had a total of $800,000 per annum, which, as I think it was discussed yesterday in the questioning of ACMA, that is recovered from the carriers as part of the carrier licence fees, and that had been sitting at $800,000 per annum for a number of years. The Minister took the view that that should be increased both to recover the original value of the $800,000 because that had declined in real terms, but also to provide an additional amount of money that would, if you like, reinforce the underlying philosophy behind ACAN, which was to enhance its capacity for representation, build its ability to do much more rigorous research, and also to provide much stronger education and training activities, including training for voluntary advocates. I mentioned earlier that there's a very large number of groups that have indicated interest in affiliating with ACAN. Part of its role will be to help to train volunteers within those entities in advocacy.
What does ACAN stand for?
It's the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network.
Thanks for that. So can you just describe how you envisage it working? You mentioned there's a board, and will that board convene regular forums of the membership groups, and will they prioritise their work program? How do you actually see it working?
Some of that is still to be worked out, Senator, and until the new CEO, Alan Asher, actually takes up his role, I believe, on the 14th of July, once he arrives, some of this, I think, will become a bit clearer. The way that the department envisages ACAN working is to pick up some of the former roles of groups such as the Telecommunications Network, or CTN, and the Australian Deafness Federation, which has operated in this space as well. Those groups are involved in a range of activities. They develop common approaches to, for example, government inquiries. They sit on councils that are convened by Telstra and Optus, amongst other carriers, specifically to look at consumer issues as they come along, if they're specific to the carrier in question. Telstra, for example, has operated consumer and disability councils for a long time, where they raise issues specific to that carrier. But it's also our hope that the ACAN will create expert advisory groups that are focused on consumer issues, disability issues, and other issues on an as-needs basis as they come along, because new issues emerge from time to time, a spectacular example being mobile premium services, which was also discussed yesterday with ACMA.
So what was the final number of the financial resources to this initiative?
It's $2 million per annum indexed, so that represents an increase of $1.2 million over the existing funding.
So it's more than doubling what was paid, what was
in money
before.
terms, yes. In real terms, it's a bit less than doubling.
Yeah, yeah.
Depending upon which deflator you use, of course.
Okay. With the programs like broadband guarantee, etc., what opportunity do people with disabilities who could potentially benefit from higher bandwidth services, what level of priority, if at all, do they get in accessing some of the government's programs for higher bandwidth services?
I might have to defer to one of my colleagues on that one, Senator.
Simon Bryant, Acting First Assistant Secretary, Broadband Division Chair. I manage the Australian Broadband Guarantee Program, Senator. In terms of any specialised equipment for that program, I'm not aware that we don't have any specific accommodation for that. Clearly, people with disabilities have access to the program in the normal way that other people, and clearly we encourage our registered providers to market their services as widely as possible to consumers and to consumer groups.
Thanks, Mr. Bryant. I would imagine that, and I know we're going to go to the broadband issue shortly, but I just want to perhaps leave you with a question on notice. I would imagine that with a program in the NBN moving to a universal high bandwidth service, that this will enable a range of new applications and technologies to support people with disabilities. So I want to ask the department if they're aware of the sorts of new applications that will become available in a ubiquitous high bandwidth network, and what thinking there is or policy plans or ideas within the department there are about making sure that there is a comprehensive approach to supporting people with disabilities in that high bandwidth network. And I'm not sure how much this has to do with the feasibility study that Mr. Besgrove was referring to, but I'd like to just get a general response to what you're doing with that forward-looking agenda for people with disabilities.
Senator, I think we should take some of that on notice. The department, through its technology advisory unit, is certainly doing quite a lot of forward-looking work, and will certainly continue to do so. Just to go back to the feasibility review process for a moment, very clearly one of the imperatives that's been driving the disability community to want us to look at this, and one of the reasons why we were quite responsive to the idea of suggesting to the Minister that he agree to such a process, is that there's a very clear potential for emerging broadband applications to have quite significant impacts on the lives of people with disabilities. I don't think that the department pretends to fully understand what all of those are. If we had that sort of hindsight, we might be working somewhere else. But it's very clearly the case that in rapidly expanding broadband services will carry with them quite a range of potential applications that could be very beneficial to people with disabilities, and we're very conscious of that. So I think it's certainly germane to the feasibility study, but I think it's also important for the longer term as well.
Could I just finish up on this line of questioning by asking what is the indicative time frame for the feasibility study, and when can a group of stakeholders representing people with disabilities expect to see an outcome?
We have a commitment to go back to the Minister with a report by the end of this year.
By the end of this year?
By the end of this calendar year, yes.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. If there's no further general questions for the department, then we will move to program 1.2, telecommunications, online and postal services. So are senators aware of which items are in 1.2?
Yep, I think so.
Quite a big chair across a range of areas.
Well, Senator Minchin, you ready to go?
Well, thanks. Could I just ask briefly about ACAN? It's been mentioned a couple of times this morning. I note that it's got an additional $7.5 million over 4 years, which I presume takes its it supplements $0.8 million in existing funding allocated to ACAN in 09-10 to take it to $2 million a year. Could someone just give me the history of this consumer network? And we touched on it briefly yesterday in relation to the carriers and their support for this, but it's a not insubstantial sum of money. And I'd just like to know what ACAN is, who heads it, what salaries they're paid, what makes them the representatives of consumers, who elected them, what that operation is all about.
Okay, Senator, just very quickly, the previous government established the Section 593 arrangements back in, I think, 98, 99.
Yep.
That
was a grants program, wasn't it?
It was a competitive grants program,
yep.
And that operated over the last decade. The amount of money was not adjusted, so hence my earlier comment that it was declining in real terms. Generally speaking, over time we found that the money tended to go to the same groups of organisations. The amounts of money varied, and sometimes there were more or less groups funded, but by and large it tended to be the same groups applying for and receiving the funding over a period of about 8 or 10 years.
Well, that was a merits-based selection.
Indeed, yes, it was, but it's a limited field in practice. So what we had was the major beneficiaries in terms of funding tended to be CTN, whom I referred to earlier, CTEL, which represented the interests of small business as consumers, and ADFO TEDICOR, which represented disability groups. There were then a number of other smaller organisations that got varying amounts of money. The view emerged both within the department, within the consumer, if you like, network, and also within the industry groups, certainly Comms Alliance, which represented the carriers, that those arrangements were not working as well as they might, that the quality of some of the work coming forward could certainly be improved. The professionalism of the advocacy groups could also certainly be improved, but that the current model was unlikely to deliver those improvements over time. We certainly looked at the potential model of simply increasing the level of funding to the existing groups. Quite early on, the Minister started to encourage those groups to think about a peak organisation, and we conducted a forum on the 1st of May last year at which the Minister spoke, and I think from memory there were more than 50 different organisations present at that forum. Emerging from that forum, there was agreement to set up a working group that would then develop the idea of a peak organisation. The working group reported to the Minister, I think, by the beginning of August last year, and we had several meetings with the Minister. He indicated his support to take the idea forward, and it gained momentum from there. The Minister agreed to find some interim funding last year to support the development of the entity, and the board of the new entity met for the first time on the 17th of December last year. The process of selecting the initial board was partly done by the working group, given that they were essentially representative of the 50 different groups that were present. Throughout that process, we kept reporting back to the 50 organisations. We were providing them with monthly updates. We were also briefing Comms Alliance, and I myself had discussions with Telstra and Optus on a number of occasions, because we needed to take all of the stakeholders forward if we were to get support for this new entity. So, if you like, that's the background about where it came from. Quite early on, it became clear that the carriers themselves supported the idea. We got quite strong support from Telstra. It's fair to say that I think that was because Telstra certainly recognised that the old model wasn't all that satisfactory. Optus also supported it, and some of the other carriers to varying degrees. It's, I guess, important.
Was there any opposition from anywhere in particular?
Oh, a little bit of grumbling about the money, I suppose, but no, not really. Not really. I think there was widespread recognition that what we had probably outlived its usefulness, and that it was time to look at a different model. We have certainly been at pains to try and keep the carriers informed as much as we could within the constraints of budget confidentiality. And I think the fact that, as you were saying yesterday, no one's been complaining about it is in part reflective of the fact that the industry had recognised the need for a different model, and we've certainly had strong supportive noises from Comms Alliance and from Telstra and Optus at some of the forums that we've been present at in terms of the potential for this new entity to improve the effectiveness of the working relationships between consumers and industry in this space. And that's a working relationship which has certainly had its ups and downs, as I'm sure you may have heard.
And does this organisation have in place a full-time CEO or chief executive? Or?
It will have a full-time CEO as of, I believe, the 14th of July in the form of Mr. Alan Asher, who's formerly with the ACCC.
Yeah.
I'm sure you remember him.
I do remember Mr. Asher.
I'm sure you remember him fondly.
Yeah, he's currently overseas.
Telstra thrilled about that, are they?
Sorry?
Telstra thrilled with that appointment, are
They have not expressed reservations to me, but
I think they've got a few other things on their
Better
mind.
than having Mr Samuel appointed.
yes. So does that give you enough, Senator?
Yeah, well, what other income will this body have, or is it fully funded by the federal government?
Initially, it will be fully funded by the federal government. Mr Asher has already suggested to the ACAN board that he'll be exploring alternative sources of funding.
I'm just wondering what accountability and reporting mechanisms are in place if it is fully funded or largely fully funded by the federal government without the... Because, I mean, you know, I accept what you're saying about the old scheme, but at least competitive grant schemes are competitive. There is a certain degree of accountability, review, and you've got to make your case. The only danger with this sort of model is, you know, it's a monopoly provider of consumer advice, fully funded, and you know, who's it accountable to, and how does it account for its performance?
So, how many members were there?
Well, there's at least 50, but I guess, Minister, the other comment I was going to make is we're currently negotiating a funding agreement with the new entity. I can assure you that we're treating that negotiation very seriously. The department will be stating quite explicitly the government's expectations of the new body, and the process of ACAN's implementation and activities will be reviewed in 2 years' time. So we will be paying close attention to all of that. I'm certainly conscious of the danger you raise.
Would there be any reason why Mr Asher couldn't appear before estimates on behalf of his network to
I might just see if the Minister has a view on that.
I was wondering if there would be any difficulty with Mr Asher being invited by this committee to appear at estimates to give us a report on his activities and how he's spending $2 million of taxpayers' money.
I am sure that Mr Asher, given his past record, will be forthright in appearing before many committees. However, as he's not an officer, I'm not sure this is the appropriate one, but I am sure, Senator Minchin, if you turn up to as many committees as Mr Asher by the time you do leave politics, you'll have done well.
So this committee could invite him to...
I'm not sure that he's actually an officer of the department, and so I don't think it's appropriate for him to appear here. Mr Besgrove can happily answer questions about their activities,
I think it's important for this committee
but I'm sure that you will not be shy, and Mr Asher certainly won't be shy at appearing before many parliamentary committees, and you'll have an opportunity to question him at considerable length. But I'm not sure Senate Estimates is quite the appropriate place.
Okay. When did the previous program actually terminate? Or when was the last grants? When were the last grants actually made? Is that continuing through 0809? Financial year 0809, were grants paid out?
I might have to take that on notice so that I don't mislead the committee in terms of the exact description. The competitive grants process finished with the current financial year.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind knowing what grants will have been paid in 0809 and to whom and what size.
We can certainly provide all of that.
All right, that's all I had on that. Chairman.
Right. Simon, Senator Lundy.
We're on 1, 2.
I've got questions for broadband guarantee.
Senator Lundy, you want to do that?
Fantastic.
Whichever.
There you go.
Can the department outline how the program functions generally, and in particular what the definition of a metro comparable service is, please?
Yes, Senator. Excuse me. Perhaps it might be best to start with a description of the overall objective of the program, which is to provide access to that term metro comparable broadband services for all residences and small businesses across Australia where such access is not available through commercial means. So it's really trying to provide a safety net for, as I said, residences and small businesses, that is 20 full-time employees and under, where the commercial market is not providing those services. So in that sense it's a highly targeted program. The definition of metro comparable broadband service currently is set at least 512 kilobits per second download and 128 kilobits per second upload, and at least 3 gigabytes per month of data allowance. And the service is also price capped, no more than $2,500 over 3 years, which would include all installation costs and CPE and charges over a 3-year period within that 3 gigabyte monthly allowance cap. That benchmark has been set bearing in mind the services broadly taken up in metropolitan areas.
Okay. I know in the 2008-9 budget, some $270.1 million was committed over 4 years. Is that figure correct?
Yeah, I think the number is actually 270.7, Senator. Yes, that was the amount that was committed. Bearing in mind there was a small amount of existing Broadband Connect funds that was added to that to get a total amount, I think, of $273.451 million.
273 million.
Yes.
451,000.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
Right.
That's over the 09-10 and 4.
No, over the 4 years from starting 08-09,
08-09.
9-10, 10-11, 11-12.
Right.
Okay. I read an article in The Australian back in earlier this month, I think it was on the 14th, titled 40 million shaved off rural broadband subsidies. Is there any truth to that or to that article? And are you familiar with it?
Well, there have been savings identified, but 40 million is not the correct figure. The correct figure is 23.1 million, including departmental costs, so that's administered and departmental.
Right.
And to break that down further, 20.554 is the administered savings and 2.567 is the departmental savings over the next 3 years.
So that's not off, that's not out of the actual subsidy to the...
No, the incentive payment per customer remains the same. It's important to understand how the program works to identify how the budget's derived, because it's a demand-driven program. So the process of identifying the funds required in any particular financial year is quite a complex process of estimating demand for program services in that year.
But it's a capped program.
It's a capped program, and that's it.
The article I refer to also says, and I quote, "The reduction includes a revised budget for the 08-09 financial year of $85 million. Is this also untrue?"
No, that's not correct. The budget for the current financial year hasn't been amended in any way.
So it hasn't changed at all? There was no $85 million reduction?
No, the $85 million is the original budget for 08-09 remains intact.
So why was a reduction in funding for the Australian Broadband Guarantee announced in the last budget, that 23
Well, as I said,
million
the process of estimating a budget for the program is a fairly complex demand estimation process, and the elements of that estimation are really threefold, I think. Firstly, as I said, the program targets areas where commercial market is not providing metro comparable services. So inherent in that concept is the concept of underserved premises, which are where we've identified that those commercial services are not being provided. And so clearly, as commercial services roll out into those areas, the underserved premises pool reduces, and therefore the demand on program funds reduces as well. Then, of course, you have to take into account the overall demand for program services within that underserved premises pool, and that's really a combination, again quite difficult to estimate, of the general demand within the community, within residences and small businesses for broadband services generally, plus any pent-up demand that may exist within those particular pool of premises for broadband services. So we've taken that into account as well, and to support that we've done quite a significant survey of regional customers focusing on our areas of Australian Broadband Guarantee areas, which are essentially in the more rural and remote areas, to try and understand what the take-up rates have been and what the likely demand is going to be over the next few years. And the third part of the equation is the cost per incentive payment. Now, the incentive payments are set at standardised rates, but we do have introduced into the program a concept of additional high-cost payments, so that the total payment per customer can be as high as $6,000 inclusive, to take into account the fact, as I said, that we are now targeting more and more remote areas, and our registered providers have identified to us in the past that some of these areas are very, very difficult and very costly to install services into. Some of the remote islands, for example, some of the areas in northern Australia where cyclone-proof installation is required. So we've introduced into the program this concept of additional high-cost payments, which are pre-approved and work through on that basis. So we have to take into account the extent to which we may be required to fund more and more of those kinds of services as well.
Just going back to, you mentioned, I think, the first sort of three areas. So where carriers are providing metro, are expanding their footprint of metro comparable broadband services, obviously the demand for the subsidy under broadband guarantee diminishes. So which carriers expanded their footprint in an identifiable way that you weren't having to provide a subsidy for their product anymore?
The key ISP really has been Optus with its its broadband wireless service over its 3G network. As I'm sure you're aware, that's been the subject of some discussion in the media and amongst the industry. But we've tested that network and we believe it's metro comparable, and so we've factored that in as well. By no means the only metro comparable commercial service. Obviously, we have in the order of, I think, 29 commercial networks deemed to be metro comparable, plus, of course, all of the ADSL retailers as well.
And just for the record, Optus didn't receive a government subsidy for the rollout of their 3G wireless network, did they?
No, as I said, an important part of the program is trying to target subsidised services at areas where commercial services aren't. Optus is one of those commercial services, so the process has been trying to identify where they are going with that service, and then making sure the customers who can't get that service continue to get an ABG service.
And are there other examples of carriers rolling out and expanding their services and thereby being deemed metro comparable for the purposes of the Australian Broadband Guarantee?
Yes, this same process has been in place really over the previous iterations of the program, going right back to 2004 with the original high bandwidth incentive scheme. It's been about targeting the subsidised support to those areas where the commercial market's not going. As I said, we've up to now 29 commercial networks that are identified as metro comparable. I mean, that's really important, not just to make sure that government support is targeted to areas of need, but it's also very important that that subsidised support doesn't unfairly compete with commercial networks that are out there providing a decent service. So that's really the policy rationale for that kind of approach.
Sure. So what I'm just trying to clarify, that under the previous government as well, there have been services rolled out that have previously been declared metro comparable for the purposes of this broadband guarantee style subsidy.
Yes, as I said, that's been the case since this kind of program was introduced in 2004.
No, that's certainly my understanding. How do people go about finding out whether they're potentially eligible for an Australian broadband guarantee subsidy?
Three ways, really. The program works by registering service providers to offer subsidised services to eligible premises and eligible customers, and we've always relied on those service providers to market their services to consumers, and they do that, and they're obviously required to recognise the government support in doing that. But the department also has two key channels for consumers to find out where and how they can get a service and whether they're eligible. The first and most important is the Broadband Service Locator on the Department's website, which is an online tool which allows any person in Australia to put in their address, put in their GPS details if they live on a property, and then what will happen is they'll see the map of their particular address and a list of, if there are commercial providers offering metro comparable services, they will be listed, and then if they're not, they will see what subsidised ABG providers are available to them. And that process also allows them to do two other things. Firstly, to get an information pack which sets out all of the details about the program and details about providers that are available to them, and also allows them to register their interest in getting an ABG service. That's, we think, a user-friendly system and well received, but we do have an 1800 number as well and staff within the department support consumers who may find that a bit daunting or may not have internet access, for example.
Well, that's right. They might be looking for internet access.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Yes. So we have an 1800 number, 1800 883 488, which is available.
Well, that's good, because that will now appear in Hansard. So thank you for that. You might just want to say it again slowly, so we can, just like on TV. Okay, so back in February, I think it was, the government announced additional funding for broadband guarantee. Is that right?
No, we announced a new funding round.
A new funding round. So what does that mean? And did that have anything to do with Optus's network?
The way the program works is, on a periodic basis, the department calls registration rounds,
right,
where applicants are invited to register to become registered providers under the program. And in general, we try to do two rounds per year. The purpose of that really is to give new applicants an opportunity to register under the program, but also where applicants have failed to meet specific criteria in the assessment criteria, to address the deficiencies that we've identified to them and to have another go if they want to. They want to.
So there's a quality control about people who are participating in the scheme.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that over the last 2 or 3 years, we've tightened up the financial viability requirements under the program. They're quite strict. We don't resolve from that in any way, apart from prudent use of taxpayers' money. But it's very important also to have sustainable services being provided to consumers. And bear in mind as well that the program, as I said, is now focusing on rural and remote areas increasingly as those commercial networks roll out, and therefore much more marginal markets. Yeah. We think that means we need to keep a very vigilant eye to make sure that providers are viable and that the services they're offering are sustainable. The program guidelines clearly state that the purpose of the program is not to support the business case for providers to operate generally, but to support viable operators to extend their services into these more marginal markets. Is an important difference.
Can you tell me whether the department was out there encouraging people to become parties to the register? Because I think this allegation was made at some point.
Yes, I think the allegation was that having declined some applicants, we turned around then and re-invited them to apply. What we did was, as we always do, is notify people of a new registration round and indicate to them if they wish to apply, then here are the contact details. As I said, I mean, the purpose of that really is that some providers may want to address the feedback we've given them in an unsuccessful application and resubmit. Indeed, some have, some haven't. But it's just a quite formal and flat process of notifying people of a new registration round and by no means encouraging them or inviting them to apply.
So what is the process for assessment once carriers apply or ISPs apply?
It's comprehensive. The guidelines set out the assessment process in great detail. There's a screening process to ensure that sufficient information is provided to make a meaningful assessment. There are clearly rules around who can apply. Straight resellers can't apply. People have to be adding some infrastructure and some value add into the process. As well, there is a detailed assessment of financial viability and corporate credibility, of the service solution, the technology to be applied, the service plans that are proposed, and finally the service areas. And all of that is set out in detail in the guidelines, not just the criteria but the information that the department requires to assess applications. Then there's a very strict process of ensuring that we don't give feedback, encouragement or any information to applicants as to the status of their application. When we don't tell applicants, we really like your application, or we don't like it. We have to be as flat as we can. We do seek clarification from time to time if the information provided isn't sufficient for us to make a proper assessment. But we do take great care not to prejudice the assessment process by giving inappropriate feedback to applicants.
Yeah, I certainly I'm concerned about the prospects of small businesses who are infrastructure providers, who are being quite entrepreneurial in providing new wireless services in places where no one else will. If they're unhappy with the decision of the department's rejection of their application, what recourse, if any, do businesses in that position have in challenging that decision?
They can certainly seek detailed feedback on the decision, but I mean, the guidelines clearly state that, as I say, set out the process in great detail, the assessment criteria in great detail.
Yeah. No, I understand the need for procedural fairness. I'm just concerned that if a small business that isn't well resourced to provide all of that detailed information gets knocked back, I just want to check that, one, there's recourse, but two, there then is a subsequent opportunity for them to get the feedback necessary. They can make adjustments to their business to make sure they're eligible. Because, to be frank, if they don't qualify, if they're a very small business going into a new area, this will wreck their business case if they can't access the program as a registered supplier.
Well, two things to say about that, really. Firstly is that the whole process of having regular registration rounds, detailed feedback, clear, precise, comprehensive guidelines is really designed to allow people, if they want to get into the program, to learn from the assessment process and to resubmit. But it's important also to, and we do make it clear to providers in a general sense and to applicants in a general sense, that this is not easy yards. I mean, it is hard yards going into these areas, and we have a primary concern that consumers get access to a sustainable service and that the operation of applicants is sustainable in its own right without government support. That's a very important point. So it may well be that some small providers just simply don't have the financial sustainability to get into those difficult areas. And we don't resile from the fact that we're not industry support mechanism. We're there to provide services to consumers.
Yeah. No, I do appreciate that. How many applications were assessed in that February round?
We've had 5 applications, and we're close to completion of our assessment of those applications.
So not everyone has to reapply each round. Is that how it works? Or?
No. As I said, and we make and the guidelines themselves clearly indicate to providers it's really up to them if they want to apply for the program.
Yep. So how many registered providers are there under the scheme?
16 registered providers at the moment.
How many are satellite service providers?
10 offer satellite services. Some, they're not exclusive, some offer satellite and wireless.
How much does it... Can you tell the committee how much it costs to sign up a customer to a satellite service, i.e. the setup costs?
Well,
I guess what I'm asking is what
are
the size of the grants for a satellite service provider?
as I said, the overall approach of the program is to provide standard payments, and for satellite and wireless providers in rural areas, the amount is $2,500. As I said, there are additional high-cost payments up to $6,000 to take into account special circumstances. The important also to recognise, I think, the $2,500 is not just to connect the customer and set them up; it's to provide a service for a 3-year period. And certainly in the case of satellite providers, there are some satellite support costs within that structure, and there are, again, a range of obligations and costs that the providers have to wear in meeting the ABG standards. So it's to really connect and supply a service for a 3-year period. Having said that, there are also costs to install, travel, the customer equipment is expensive, and a component of that $2,500 goes to support that as well.
So $2,500?
Yes.
Okay. Again, I want to refer to an article in The Australian on the 12th of May, which was titled "Bushnet Funding Program Criticised," which argued that some of the Australian Broadband Guarantee registered companies have been left out of pocket after the application process during, I think, the latter half of 2008, on the grounds that they couldn't do it in a financially viable way. What's the real story behind that article, and is that true?
Well, I'm not going to make any comment about whether individual applicants were and were not financially viable, but clearly financial viability is one of the assessment criteria. The other important point to make is that the guidelines really clearly say that the cost of you applying for the program is entirely to be borne by you, the applicant, and the department doesn't support costs of applying to the program. And again, those applicants have to bear that risk. I think the allegation also in that particular article was that somehow or other we'd encouraged them to think that they were going to get registered and then dropped them at the last minute. That certainly was not the case. We're very, very have a high priority to ensure that we don't provide any encouragement or feedback to applicants about how their application is going. That's quite important. We do seek clarification from time to time, as I said, but it's important that we follow due process.
Right. So am I correct in saying that the scheme did run out of funding back in 2007 under the former government?
Well, not the Broadband Connect scheme, which was a similar scheme. I think in March 2007, the total funds were expended at that time. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And perhaps a final question to the Minister. Minister, can you tell the committee if the opposition committed to funding the Australian Broadband Guarantee in the lead up to the 2007 federal election, despite the fact that the scheme ran out of funding in that year as well?
Yeah, look, after extensive looking through the previous government's election commitments and budget papers, there was no ongoing funding, no commitment. The program was terminated.
Oh, this is a nonsense and abuse of the committee. You know that was because of the OPEL project. You know we were putting $1 billion, which you cancelled, and deprived rural Australia of the services. Now, after 18 months of your government, you've got nothing. So don't try and play those silly political tricks here. It's ridiculous.
Well, I think the point's well made, and I thank the Minister
absolutely
for answering
ridiculous.
my question.
The budget documents speak for themselves, Senator Lundy.
Yeah, and you just cancelled $1 billion of spending in rural Australia.
Terminated.
Which amounts to $2 billion
terminated
of rural
the program.
spending that isn't happening because of your cancellation of that project. So don't play that cute game.
Order. We'll return to questions. Have you finished, Senator Lundy?
Well, that was in fact my final question, because I think it's an important point of clarification in the context of the public commentary about the success with which the current government is implementing the Australian Broadband Guarantee program. Thank you.
Senators Minchin or Birmingham? Senator Minchin?
Yeah, just a few on this ABG. The profiling of what amounts to really a 10% reduction in expenditure on this program is rather odd. It's 11 million this coming year, then 9, then 3. What is the profile of the total forward estimate for the program?
I think that's on page 42 of the budget statement, Senator.
85, 59,
46, 38. So you can see there's a tapering off.
It's fairly dramatic. It halves over the next 4 years. It goes from, 85 in 08-09, very substantial drop then in 9-10, by effectively, that's 25 million drop this coming year.
Yeah, as I said, Senator, I mean, it's not an easy forecasting exercise, but one of the important elements of those three different variables that I mentioned is the overall demand for metro-comparable broadband services in those areas. We've just done a fairly large regional survey, as I indicated, which demonstrated, I think, to our satisfaction that there is widespread take-up of broadband services in the target areas, and that we would expect the overall level of demand for within that pool of underserved premises to reduce significantly over that period of time.
Certainly do. I mean, expenditure in 11-12 will be less than half what it was in this current financial year.
Yes.
That's in anticipation of the further rollout of 3G, etc. Is it?
Well, that's one of the elements, and certainly we do expect that to happen. We've got Optus rolling out, as you know, but also Vodafone getting into the market. But I think the key factor in that reduction is the overall level of demand for services. Based on history, the level of per annum take-up is around about 3.8 to 4% of that underserved premises pool. We've looked at, as I said, through this survey, at what the take-up rates are, and it's surprisingly high in those areas. And we estimate approximately about a 15% pool over that 4 years. Some component of that will be the overall level of demand over a 4-year period. So you can see that we think we're approaching the top of the S-curve, and other information that we have supports that as well.
Can I return to the same report that Senator Lundy referred to, which does involve, as I understand it, the great state of South Australia, which Senator Birmingham and I are proud to represent, because it does quote a broadband officer with the South Australian Government, Louise Sladden, and Anita Crisp, the Executive Officer of the South Australia Central Local Government Region, representing 15 regional councils, as, quote, appalled by the treatment of these applicants in South Australia and the way the department handled this whole process, presumably on the basis of people being rejected and then asked to reapply or invited to reapply. But if they're rejected, it says here, disqualified because they couldn't prove they were financially viable, why would you invite them to reapply?
Well, I repeat, Senator, we didn't invite them to reapply. We have a list of interested parties who we notify of registration rounds as a matter of courtesy. I think, given the fact that a number of them do seek to address deficiencies that we've identified in their applications and to reapply, I think it's courteous and proper that we do notify a broad spectrum of people, of parties of a new registration round. So that's point number one. Point number two is that in some cases, despite the fact we've sought clarifying information, we haven't got enough information to make a decision. In other cases, deficiencies in their application may well be addressed by specific action they might wish to take.
Well, I mean, it's not helpful to you, the department or the program, to have, state and local government officers who presumably work hard to help facilitate these applications. They're, dedicated to improving broadband service in the regions, so openly and publicly attacking the program. I mean, what steps are you taking to ensure that state and local governments who are assisting applicants or involved in this program to understand the way you're operating? I mean, it's not very helpful for anybody to have
No, I agree, it's
such
not
overt
helpful.
criticism, but I don't presume you're not just sitting back. I mean, what
No,
are you
we're
doing to help them understand the way the program works? And
Well, we've got a number of channels to get to people. We have important bilateral relations with all the state governments and with local government. We have fora such as a National Broadband Development Group where we work through issues with people. We always invite both applicants and people who support applicants to talk to us about any of the issues that we've identified in failed applications. I certainly agree it's not very helpful, but we're always keen to have dialogue with people about the issues that surround the program.
well, have you identified, failings in your systems that lead to this sort of quite vitriolic complaint from other levels of government about the way this program operates, or you just think they don't understand?
I don't think. I think, as I've explained to Senator Lundy, I think the process we went through was a proper process. It's about getting an appropriate balance between giving opportunities for applicants and making sure that government support funding is provided appropriately and sustainably, and that taxpayers' funds are well spent on getting sustainable services in place. I don't know. I think inevitably there will be winners and losers, and some people may take exception. I'm not sure there's much we can do about that. I mean, but to reiterate my point is that we do seek to talk to these people, and we've talked to the South Australians about these particular disgruntled people, and we'll follow through on that again. We've just recently been to South Australia.
I think one of the reasons you've had difficulty recently was the sort of declaration, or however you want to describe it, of Optus 3G as a metro comparable service, and the extent to which that is understood to have affected applicants and things. But you mentioned the locator in talking to Senator Lundy. Have you? What's the mechanism by which you amend the locator and the information it provides once you do declare a service to be a provider of metro equivalent?
Yes, well, clearly when we identify commercial services as metro comparable, we have to get information about what the coverage of those services is. We rely on goodwill from those commercial providers. We don't have any contractual relationship with those providers, obviously, but it's in their interest to get onto our broadband service locator because, in a sense, it's a free marketing device, because every time someone comes in, they'll see that commercial service there. So that's the carrot we try to provide to providers. And in the main, I think providers have been keen to be involved in that process. They've provided us with their mapping data that assists us to map their services. The way the broadband service locator works is it's driven geospatially, and services are mapped as tightly as we can.
But
clearly,
you
in the
simply
case,
take their map of coverage and...
Well, clearly in the case of Optus and their coverage of their wireless service over their 3G network, the coverage is not the same as the coverage of mobile services. It's much more restricted than that. We've had an extensive process of working with Optus to clarify what the exact coverage is, or what the more exact coverage is, and it's a continuing process of updating the information. We're getting much better information on that coverage now. Bear in mind, though, that if there are inaccuracies in their mapping, to the extent that they say they can go somewhere where they can't, our customers, eligible ABG consumers, can still get an ABG service. The process is that they're referred to the commercial provider in the first instance as saying that commercial provider may well be able to provide them with a metro comparable service, and then the process is if they can't provide them with a service, they come back to us and then they become eligible for an ABG service. So the issue is not so much consumers missing out on a subsidised service where they are in fact eligible. It's really just the process of having to go to the commercial provider and come back, and it's an inconvenience for them, and it's a resource for us.
But some people, the locator will tell you if you are ineligible.
The locator will tell you where a commercial metro comparable service may be able to be provided, and then refers you to that commercial provider in the first instance.
On the basis that you're ineligible?
No, not on the basis that you may be able to get a service from that provider. If you can, then you are ineligible. If you can't, you can come back and become eligible to get an ABG service.
So is it possible that this locator could tell people in one street that, you know, some of them are eligible and others are not eligible?
Again, it's a really important point actually, that the locator doesn't say you can get a commercial service from this provider, therefore you can't get one from us. It says we have identified that this commercial provider may be able to offer you a metro comparable commercial service. Please go and talk to that provider first. If you can't get a metro comparable service, come back to us, and then generally the way we do that is via our call centre. But we have also developed a capacity now for consumers to push themselves through and to then sign a declaration that declares that they've been to that provider and they can't get a service. So it works, as I said, as a safety net, and consumers can always come back if they can't get the commercial service.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks. That's all I have.
Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Chair. Not too much left on the broadband guarantee, but just quickly, in terms of your estimations for demand, you believe that page 44 of the PBS at the bottom there outlines the number of connections subsidised over the forward estimates.
Yep.
And your estimations are that that satisfies demand in each year?
That's our estimation, yes.
That's your estimation, so that the demand is tapering off through those years down to 13,900 in 2011-12.
Correct.
Will there... Sorry. Those estimations of demand, which I think we discussed in last year's estimates as well, as to how you were constructing estimations of demand to some extent, are they, or were they premised when they were initially done last year on successful completion of the national broadband network?
No.
Okay, so there's no consideration of NBN delivering either NBN 1 or NBN 2 delivering anything in any of these forward years for the ABG estimates?
In terms of this level of service, no.
Right. For 2012-13, would you still expect there to be some level of residual demand?
I can't. I mean, we've done these estimates based on these forward estimates. I don't think I can comment any further than that.
Okay. But we drop from 34,000 to 22,000, then from 22 to 17, so you lose about 5 there, then from 17 to 13, so you lose about 4 there. It would appear to me that if the same tapering off rate occurred, there would still be probably about 10,000 demand for about 10,000 connections in 2012-13 if you follow the tapering off pattern.
Well, that's your observation, Senator. I mean, we haven't done the estimation for 2012-13, so I don't want to comment on that.
Okay. Minister, you were eager to take a swipe at the previous government before, and eager in response to Senator Lundy to highlight the government's commitment to this service. If there's still demand in 2012-13, will the government still be funding it?
Well, we would be considering that closer to the day. We, unlike the previous government, have just given it a funding commitment.
You haven't just, you did it last year, but...
Well, last year.
You've actually just taken funding out of it this year.
Well, as I mean, I know that you pay close attention during Senate estimates, Senator Birmingham, so I'm sure you've heard the lengthy and detailed explanation as to the growing availability of metro comparable. I would anticipate that will continue to grow. The Vodafone network is coming into play. The Optus network is coming into play. There's a variety of other potential metro comparable projects that are being done by the private sector, even before you get to the government's NBN plans. So to try and speculate in the way you are it's fun playing politics, but in terms of who committed to deliver, Labor did, the coalition didn't.
Minister, I'm just asking you to speculate into the final year of the forward estimates. It's not an unreasonable speculation to go that far out, because of course all of your forward estimates attempt to go that far out, except in this instance, the program which you've taken funding out of this year, funding that could theoretically have been allocated into 2012-13 if there is a demand for 10,000 connection subsidies.
Well, we appreciate your desire to lock us into funding commitments 3 years or 4 years.
I think you were going to say election commitments then.
Well, it would constitute an election commitment, but we'll decide our own funding envelope and our own election commitments. But I appreciate your attempts.
You'll save the announcements for the election commitments, I think is what you mean.
No, I'm just not going to let you make our election commitments or our budgetary commitments. But the situation is very clear. We funded this program ongoingly. You did not. It could not be simpler than that. And if you think by dancing around in 4 years' time and pointing to that in 4 years' time you'll be taken seriously by the Australian public, I'm sure you'll be disappointed.
Thank you, Minister. Mr Bryant, just to be clear, how many connections have been subsidised to date this financial year?
I can take the exact number on notice, but it's close to 30,000.
Close to 30,000. So you're tracking pretty close to the revised estimate of 34,300.
The estimate for this year is for the full amount. We're tracking pretty close to the 85 million. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Can I just come back to this issue of this locator?
Sure.
Because my attention's been drawn to an example in Harricott Way, Lilydale, where at 11 and 19 Harricott Way, this is in the one street, based on the information provided, your premises have been identified as Category A providers. Category A providers, and then the user is told that they provide land-based services, and then it says you are not eligible for a subsidised Australian Broadband Guarantee broadband service, and you should not complete the Broadband Guarantee registration form. It's not, doesn't quite. I note that at number 8 and number 10 Harricott Way, they're regarded as in Category D, internet service providers providing satellite services, and they're encouraged to pursue that option, all in the one street. But I understood you to say that it doesn't actually
it doesn't
tell you you're not eligible, but it does tell you you're not eligible. But people in the other part of the street may be eligible.
I'm not sure what part of the website you're referring to there, Senator.
About wireless and satellite technology, Senator mentioned. I
asked the question before. Is it possible that somebody...
Sometimes there can be a tree in the way, sometimes there can be a high-rise in the way. A whole range of factors come into play about whether an individual residents can actually receive a certain technology. That's why you want to try and reach as many of them with a fibre connection as you can, Senator Minchin.
Okay. Yeah,
you don't have to worry about trees, don't have to worry about high-rise buildings, hills.
Okay. Wonderful world you live in where you just borrow it and spend it. I wish I lived in that world.
It might be best if I
thought I understood you to say that the locator will not actually say to anybody, you are not eligible, whereas it clearly it does.
Again, I'll perhaps take your question on notice, but the clear process, and I can provide a detailed reference to all of the parts of the locator, but the clear process is that if you don't, and the locator does say it, that if you can't get a commercial metro comparable broadband service from that Category A provider, and I'm not sure what part of the locator you're looking at there, but it should say that you may be able to get a service from this provider.
It says you're not eligible for a subsidised service. Somebody may be able to offer you a metro comparable service. Don't complete the form, but it's basically saying, forget about this program. Go and,
Again, perhaps if I take your question on how the locator works on notice, I'm happy to provide you with a detailed reference because it is, as I said, not a simple process, and there's a process of going backwards and forwards, and that's within the locator. But I'll certainly take that on notice.
Yeah, my impression is that this is causing some considerable confusion out there.
Yeah, well,
Anyway.
sometimes things can be improved.
Okay, thanks.
I sat in, when I first came to the department, I sat in on phone calls with people ringing up our little call centre and using the locator, that sometimes people volunteered that they knew that neighbours, or friends, a block and a half away, were getting services that they couldn't get, and it seemed to be some of the limitations inherent in the system, in RIMS and pair gains and so on, that you could find even within a relatively short space of distance. Now, I'm not familiar with this Harcourt Avenue, but I do know from that listening in that people within, I think, a block and a half were pointing out to our operator and me that the disparity in the service offerings sometimes as a result of historical factors and the rollout of services. So we'll look into it.
Even windmills.
Yeah, I mean, it's undoubtedly true that it is a reasonably complicated process. When you have a highly targeted program, it's necessarily so. And it's undoubtedly true.
You're basically relying entirely on the coverage maps of the providers as well in doing this too.
Well, not entirely, as I said, because the way the program works is that if you can't actually get that coverage, you can get back to us. We are actually about to post up a detailed FAQ, which I'm more than happy to provide to your notice as well, which in fact I proofread yesterday, which sets out the process, hopefully, as simply as we possibly can for consumers, because it's fair to say that consumers have been confused by it in the past. It's one of the reasons, in fact, why we've set up our call centre. We have about 15 people working full time dealing with consumer queries. In fact, we've sent out 50,000 information packs this year to consumers and that 50,000 tells them very clearly the process. But, as I said, sometimes a word or two expressed the wrong way can lead to problems and confusion, so we're happy to address it where that's identified.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. If there's no further questions for the ABG senators, we are due to go to a tea break in 5 minutes, so perhaps we'll go early.
Yep.
If that's okay. The committee will then suspend until 11 o'clock promptly.
In response to the Glasson review on regional telecommunications, please.
I'm sure that we can provide you much information on that matter.
Senator, as you're aware, the Glasson review report was provided to the government in...
Sorry, Mr Cameron, can you just identify yourself?
Sorry, James Cameron, First Assistant Secretary, Regional Strategy, Digital Economy and Research Division. As you're aware, Senator, the Glasson report was provided to the government in September of last year. On the 5th of March this year, the government tabled its response to that report, which included responding to most of the recommendations of the report. That initial response included a $61.1 million package of funding measures, which comprised the $46 million Digital Regions Initiative program, which will fund innovative broadband applications to improve emergency services, health and education services in regional areas, an $11.4 million commitment to continue and enhance the satellite phone subsidy scheme for Australians living and working in areas without terrestrial mobile phone coverage, and an additional $3.7 million contribution, which will bring to a total of $30 million for a refocused Indigenous communications program that provides improves basic telecommunication services such as community phones and public internet access services and training in remote Indigenous communities.
Right. And are they all of the measures that have been committed to in response to the Glasson report?
In the recent budget, the government announced an additional commitment of $14 million in relation to the Digital Regions Initiative, which brings the total funding for that program to $60 million. In addition, that initial response responded to a range of other recommendations that did not involve funding commitments, but will involve cooperation and increased consultation with the states and territories to take forward a number of the recommendations that the committee put forward.
Okay, so the initial government response outlined a package of $61.1 million, and then further measures in the budget totalled $14 million, bringing the commitment in response to Glasson to about $75 million. Is that
That's correct, sir.
correct, Precy?
And that's the initial, consistent with the recommendations of the report. The Glasson report had recommended that government give consideration to initial response and then consider the further recommendations in light of the outcome of the National Broadband Network, and a number of the recommendations that were made in the report relating to consumer standards, regulatory changes and so on are effectively swept up in the discussion paper that was released also on the 7th of April as part of the National Broadband Initiative. So you can see that there's a staged response from the government to the Glasson report.
Okay. And how much is allocated for that staged response?
The total?
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Senator, the government indicated in last year's budget that up to $400 million would be available for regional telecommunications services, subject to consideration of the Glasson recommendations.
It did indicate $400 million last year, and that remains the
case.
Remains the case. Very good news. In that case, in terms of recommendations in response to the outcome of the NBN, what is the government defining as outcome in that regard now when it's considering further steps in the response to Glasson?
Senator, there were 17 recommendations that were not addressed in the initial response. 11 of those recommendations are being dealt with through the release of a discussion paper entitled "The National Broadband Network Regulatory Reform for the 21st Century Broadband," which...
Sorry, could you just repeat that again?
Sorry, a discussion paper entitled "National Broadband Network Regulatory Reform for 21st Century Broadband," which was released at the time of the announcement of the NBN outcome, which includes discussion of a number of possible reforms in relation to the telecommunications consumer safeguard framework. The government is addressing another 4 of those recommendations through the commitment of up to $43 billion for the National Broadband Network itself, including the fast tracking of and the fast tracking of up $250 million investment in competitive backhaul infrastructure in regional areas through its regional backbone Buckspots program. 2 remaining recommendations will be considered once the National Broadband Network arrangements have further advanced.
Senator, you might recall this booklet. That's the one that both James and I have referred to.
Yep. Okay. Okay, thank you, Ms Scott. Mr Cameron. The regulatory response discussion paper that you just showed us, Ms Scott, when are comments on that due, and when can those 11 recommendations that hinge on the outcome of that be considered and progressed in some manner?
Senator, the submissions are due on the 3rd of June, and the government will then deliberate the matters. The government's also indicated that its interest in undertaking some regulatory reforms this year and plans to introduce and its intention to have passage this year of a number of its regulatory reforms.
Now, just for the outstanding $325 million from the $400 million commitment, from a budgetary perspective, is that still sitting in a fund somewhere?
Yeah, it is still available and it's still effectively earmarked for this purpose, Senator.
Okay, so the funds that were raised out of the Communications Fund have been preserved so that they can definitely be accessed for this. It won't be the subject of a further budget bid or anything of that sort.
The $400 million funds are drawn from consolidated revenue, Senator.
Yeah, the Commons Fund's all gone to Senator Conroy's NBN, as I understand it.
I think we announced we were doing that. I think you you went to the toilet when that vote was on, from recollection, Senator Minchin, according to reports.
Yeah, I did. That's right. But we're just clarifying.
Along with a lot of other your colleagues. It must have been a very crowded toilet at that moment, Senator Minchin.
I didn't realise you had such interest in the toiletry habits of the coalition, Senator Conroy.
I just noted that only 5 of your colleagues actually stayed in the chamber, and everyone else apparently all needed the urge to go to the toilet as well.
Well, it's surprisingly difficult to sit next to the Labor Party in the chamber, Senator Conroy.
You should try it every now and then, Senator Minchin. It's good for the soul.
I find it very hard.
Good for the soul.
It is very challenging.
In any event, the point is the Comms Fund has effectively
we
dissolved and gone back. That money's sitting in the BAF.
You supported transferring it across.
We didn't oppose it. That's right.
No, you supported it. Your front bench decided to support it.
Many of it.
Anyway, 4 or 5 of your colleagues sat with us.
We didn't oppose it.
Some of them voted
rural
yes.
money is all out of consolidated revenue, as the office is saying.
So that $325 million that is going to come out of consolidated revenue, is that budgeted for in the forward years in some way, shape or form?
The government has indicated a commitment that up to $400 million would be available, and so its consideration of how to respond to the remaining recommendations would be consistent with that, as the Secretary said, that earmarked commitment of funding.
There's a slight difference from up to $400 million being available, and
I think that's always been the words that have been stated. I mean, I've used the words up to $400 million in the chamber, in the Parliament, in the public.
Very useful. Words up to.
Actually, Minister, allow me to quote your words from this committee hearing on the 27th of May last year. All of the interest earned, and we believe the estimate is around $400 million, will be spent on the Glasson Committee recommendations. There was no up to, there was no caveat. Now, do you stand by that statement you made in this Estimates Committee last year?
They're not inconsistent statements to what the officer said, I've said many times, and what you're quoting there. They're completely consistent.
Will you repeat those words for me? Will all of the interest, will the $400 million all be spent on the Glasson Review recommendations?
That's what the government has stated.
Right, so all of it will be spent, not up to $400 million, which can be any figure ranging up to $400 million. You've committed 75 at present. That could meet that objective.
They are not inconsistent.
Well, they may not be inconsistent.
The statements are not
however,
inconsistent.
there is a distinct difference.
The government has committed to spending the $400 million.
And you're committing again that it will be $400 million. Come back to where the other 325 is then. Will you have to be going back into the budgetary process then, if it's coming out of consolidated revenue, and bidding for that other 325. We have to be lining up in front of the
probably,
Razor gang.
You probably should.
For that
You
money.
probably should check with Senator Minchin on the finer points of what you've described as the bidding process. What you've described is not an accurate, necessarily accurate way that all.
Well,
programs.
will you tell me, Minister? Point me in the budget papers to where I can find the other $325 million.
We have a public commitment to meet that target. It couldn't be clearer. I've stated it, the budget papers last year stated it, and it remains an ongoing commitment.
How? Ongoing over what period of time? This, of course, was meant to be an every 3 to 4 year process under the Communications Fund.
Let's be very clear. Let's be very clear. These were funds to respond specifically to the Glasson report. And that's what they were identified for. And the Glasson has reported, and we have met his initial ask, the committee's initial ask. I think they talked about 15%. We've met the 15% that the committee recommended to us, and the committee recommended that we consider the remainder in the light of the NBN decision. And that's exactly what we are doing. Exactly what we're doing. There's no pretence when you crossed the floor and voted with us, the Liberal Party, on this issue. When you crossed the floor and voted with us on this issue, you understood this was not an ongoing.
We're trying to get to the bottom of where your $400 million has gone.
An ongoing commitment. This was a one-off 400 for the Glasson review. There's no ongoing. Your program, you voted to terminate.
Now, are you basically saying, when you talk about the NBN process, which we've learnt in the past 18 months or so, of course, is a bit like the piece of string that never ends, that regional Australia could be waiting 10 plus years to see the remaining $325 million spent anywhere?
The regional review recommended to government that responses relating to the NBN are held until the outcome is fully known.
Right, and how do you define what the outcome being fully known of the NBN is?
Well, at this stage, the final outcome is not known. And it's a matter.
That is plainly obvious for all to see.
It's a matter of ongoing discussions between ourselves and the Tasmanian government. It's a matter of an ongoing tender process to be commenced shortly for the regional backhaul black spots program. It's an ongoing process of the implementation study, which will report in February next year. It's an ongoing discussion with satellite, wireless and fibre owners at the moment to meet the National Broadband Network proposal. Yeah. All of those are ongoing. So to suggest that there is a fixed date, what we've said is that the project will take up to 8 years. We haven't tried to pretend that this is anything other than the largest infrastructure project in Australia's history.
Will the outcome be known at the end of the scoping study in February next year, or will it not be known for 8 years, assuming all of your targets are met?
It's an implementation study.
It's
an implementation study.
That's right, you're not doing a scoping study.
No, don't bother with that.
Sorry about that.
It's an implementation study which will recommend to the then board how to implement our proposal to round out all of those issues which have been legitimately raised by not only yourselves but also many in the sector. We're not going to rush simply because you're demanding we have an outcome before we actually have it, just because you're demanding.
I'm not demanding you have it before you have it. I'm just trying to find out when you're going to have it, Minister.
As I said,
can you tell me when?
Now you're talking about two different things.
At what point in all of these processes?
Now you're talking about two different things, so let's just be clear.
No, at what point in all of these different processes will the Glasson requirement for an outcome to the NBN be met? What do you define to be the outcome? We'll
see what the implementation study provides to us, and then we might be in a better position to make an assessment along the lines that you're calling for.
Okay.
So at that point we'll be able to make an assessment of the question you're asking.
So we take this as a don't know, but
No,
the $325 million out of the 400 remains unbudgeted and somewhere in the never, and regional Australia just has to wait and see what happens with the NBN.
It remains an ongoing public commitment by the government that was listed in last year's budget papers. It's an ongoing commitment.
No. It's not listed in the budget papers, Minister. Show me where it is in the budget papers.
Sorry, described, listed, described, whichever word you
spending
prefer.
The allocation of money is nowhere there. $75 million out of the 400 is allocated in the budget papers. The other 325 has vanished.
I guess if I could just repeat to you, the regional review recommended to government that responses relating to the NBN are held until the outcome is fully known. And that's exactly what we're doing. We have a public commitment and we are actually following the recommendations of the review.
And you can't tell me when that outcome will be known or at what threshold point has to be crossed for you to be able to define that that is the outcome.
No, I've said to you, when we receive the implementation study, we'll be in a better position to comment further on the question you've asked.
I mean, in the meantime, regional Australia is dudded, waiting on the never
regional
to
Australia,
see
regional
when they
Australia,
might have this promise honoured, if ever.
Regional Australia is the beneficiary of the ABG. It is the beneficiary of the ongoing programs which Mr Cameron has described. It is the beneficiary of the $250 million in funding for backbone black spots. Regional Australia will have the most comprehensive communications and telecommunications outcome in the Western world, certainly. And given the 18 failed broadband proposals put forward by your former government, regional Australians are going to be far better off than the Mickey Mouse failed programs that you put in place under Labor's plans.
Minister, will the $325 million, if you ever decide to attempt to fund it, be subject to be part of the 2% annual spending cap of government from here on in?
Well, this is a public commitment. So, unlike you, when we make public commitments, particularly election commitments...
Sorry, public commitment? Both?
You're trying to suggest that they conflict. All I'm saying to you is I don't believe they do conflict.
Right. But when you go to try to ever access this $325 million,
it's always easy to access when you've actually made a public commitment and you're on the record of saying you'll keep them.
No. When you go to, it's always easy to access it. It doesn't matter that, of course, there's a massive budget deficit you have to access it against. It doesn't matter there's a massive public debt you have to access it against. And it doesn't matter that there's now a promise for a spending growth cap that you have to try to access it against.
The Labor Party has delivered on each and every one of its election commitments. And in terms of the NBN, we're going to exceed it.
Aside from the NBN,
we're going to exceed our election commitment. So it is very easy for the Rudd government to say that it will deliver this because we've delivered our promises. We've delivered our public commitments. Unlike those opposites, Macca,
$300 million.
Macca, I'm so pleased that you've come. We've missed you. We have missed you. Can I say that it has been incredibly dull and boring without you? And we are sure you will now lighten the day for us. So we welcome your attendance.
I'm just interested in the $300 billion debt.
So maybe the best that regional Australia can hope for is the promise that you will deliver the extra $325 million, but it's a bit like perhaps returning the budget to surplus. No, it's somewhere out there. Somewhere out there, maybe beyond 2020, 2030, who knows where.
It's actually following the recommendation of the Glasson Review. I'd invite you to read it, because clearly you haven't. If you read it, you will find quite clearly stated. You will find it quite clearly stated.
You do it every time.
I've read it out to you, but given that you don't seem to believe that I'm giving you the correct context or quote, perhaps if you actually read the report, you would see that we're actually following the advice.
I'm sure it wasn't Dr. Glasson's.
We're actually
I'm sure
following
it wasn't
the
Dr.
advice.
Glasson's aim to
Commit
suggest
15% and wait with the other 85% till the outcomes of the NBN. Exactly what we're doing.
I'm sure it wasn't Dr. Glasson's aim that the $325 million had to wait 8+ years into the future.
Well, that's an assertion you're making that's not based
to
on
mention-
any
not-
fact.
Not to mention,
That's
of
an
course, it was
assertion.
it was
That's
a
an
vastly
assertion you're
different
making, not
NBN at
based
the
on-
time he made that recommendation.
Senator
not
and
based
Minister,
on any
can we
facts whatsoever, Senator
can we
Birmingham.
please revert to questions and answers? It's very difficult for Hansard to just transcribe talking over the top of each other. Senator Birmingham, we're still on regional telecommunications.
Well, that's fine. Look, Minister, I think we've established clearly it's not in the budget. We don't know when it will be, and we'll adopt this wait-and-see approach from the government, a bit like everything else. So that's fine for me. On
Then
the
that wasn't a
Glasson
question,
review.
it was a commentary, I repeat. We are following the recommendations of the Glasson review. We've delivered the 15% and we're awaiting the outcome of the NBN policy.
And I'm quite sure that Dr. Glasson wasn't expecting to be waiting indefinitely.
He won't be waiting indefinitely.
$325 million.
That's nothing more than a bit of exaggeration to try and get a cheap headline,
Well,
Senator Birmingham, but
Well,
you're welcome to try.
You can't give me a timeline.
We're following the recommendations of the Glasson review.
You can't give me a timeline, so how
The
am I not
Glasson review
meant to think that
the
it's
Glasson
indefinite?
review didn't put a timeline on it. It suggested we wait until the outcome of the NBN policy, and that's what we're doing.
Yes, which has become an ever more shifting feast since the Glasson review was released.
Look, I'm sure we'll get to lengthy
you
debate
think
on
there
this.
will be an end point to the NBN process? I'm not
I know
sure,
there'll be no
Minister.
end point to your calls for delay so that you can go to the next election claiming we haven't delivered any broadband to anybody. I appreciate that as your entire political strategy, Senator Birmingham, but I think you'll be disappointed on that front too.
I'm sure as long as we're sitting at this table, we'll be talking about the NBN process, Minister. I'm not sure about the outcomes.
NBN is under program 1.1, so can we continue with program 1.2, please, senators?
That's all for me on Glasson.
Birmingham, Senator Minchin.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Can I just turn to a 1.2 program, and that is the develop options for government consideration of internet service provider level filtering. Can I just get a sense of the profile of expenditure under that deliverable? In the PBS on page 42 under cyber safety, which I presume covers this issue of filtering, you've got 3.7 in 0809, then 30 million in 910, and then 4.6, 3.6, 3.6. And you had, well, I'd like an explanation of the profiling, what that reflects and why the huge bulge in 910, and how that accords with your indication to us earlier that around $40 million of the total 0809 budget cyber safety provision of $125.8 million is for the purposes of developing and implementing mandatory ISP level filtering, and whether the $40 million figure is still an accurate reflection of the cost of this exercise.
Thanks, Senator. Senator, I think at the last estimates I indicated that the government had allocated out of its $125 million cyber safety program an allocation of $44.4 million for filtering.
Yeah.
That includes both PC filtering and ISP filtering.
Right.
The allocation for filtering in 2008-2009 out of that $44.4 million is 5.6.
Right.
The allocation in 2009-10 is 30.8. In 2010-11, it is 4.57, and in 2011-12, it's 3.4.
Right. The 5.6 in this current financial year includes the wind-up of the Net Alert program, does it?
When you say wind-up,
the
Senator...
residual spending on a program now terminated.
Well, no, the program has been closed to new users since the 1st of January this year.
Yep.
However, it must continue to service existing users until its originally scheduled close date in 2009-10,
right.
which means we estimate an allocation in 2008-9 for the PC filters portion of the program at 4.37 million, that's 2008-9,
Yep.
and an allocation in 2009-10 of 2.6 million.
Right.
That includes both administered and departmental funding.
Yep. Okay. So the 1.2 million residual in 0809 for filtering is essentially expenses associated with the trial of ISP level filtering?
That's correct, Senator.
Yeah. So then we come to the 30.8, which, well, as I said to you, you've got 30.5 under cyber safety on page 42, but that's administered expenses. But there's another 300,000 in departmental, is there, or something, to get you to 30.8?
If I might break up the the funding in 2009-10, Senator, the total allocation for filtering in 2009-10,
yep,
and that's following parameter adjustments for the 2009-10 budget, is 30.846.
Yeah.
And that's divided between ISP filtering and PC filtering, with PC filtering at 2.6, and the balance, which is just over 28 million, is ISP filtering.
Yeah, I was just wondering why the budget shows 30.5 as opposed to 30.8, but I assume the 300,000 difference is departmental, is it? Or
there is There is a portion for departmental in 2009-10 of 0.112 for PC filtering and 0.955 for ISP filtering. What have we got here? Cyber safety there.
The number you read out, it's only a fraction of a difference.
I'll need to take on...
Unless this is in outturn and yours is not in outturn. I wonder if that could be...
It could be. I might have to take on notice, Senator, the difference between the 30.5 million and the 30.8 million.
Yeah.
And
well,
we'll get to you.
It says administered, so I assume the difference is departmental. But
I'll need to check that.
Right.
If I can take on notice the difference, Senator, and we'll get to the bottom of that difference.
Can you give us any breakdown of the anticipated and considerable sum of 28 million? You've already told us 22.6 is for the close down, essentially, of Net Alert. The 28 million that you propose to spend in the forthcoming financial year on ISP level filtering, have you got a break of that expenditure?
We don't have a break of that expenditure at this stage, Senator, because that will be dependent on the outcome of the filtering pilot and the decisions government makes on the precise details of its policy approach to dealing with ISP level filtering. Essentially, those funds have been carried over for a number of years when originally there was an allocation of, and I just need to check.
Your policy failed so miserably, there was lots of funds left over.
There was originally an allocation, and I'll need to check the precise number, but it was something over $80 million for both a combination of ISP filtering and PC filtering. The ISP filtering portion of that has simply been carried through, awaiting the details of how that particular aspect of the policy would be implemented.
Sorry, you're saying it's a combination of the monies previously allocated for PC filtering for which there was not the demand that had been anticipated?
No. The allocation of 80+ million was for both ISP filtering and PC filtering.
By the current government?
No, by the previous government.
Right. Well, remind me of that, because that wasn't a mandated scheme. That was... Just remind me of the break on that.
I think some monies were... Former Minister decided some money should be put forward to test ISP filtering.
Right. So that's simply been lumped into... So there's no... In a sense, what I'm asking is there's no ground-up estimate of the requirement in 910 that leads you to the figure of 28 million. It's simply the sum that's sort of been in the budget for some time.
It's a residual.
Filtering.
That's right.
So,
it's a residual.
And you don't have, at this stage, any idea how that 28 million might be divided or expended?
As I said, Senator, we're not in a position to do that until we've completed the pilot and government has given consideration to the detailed nature of its policy.
Now, I understand in terms of if we could just turn to the pilot, I understand some 287,000 has been allocated to 7 of the 8 trial participants. Is that correct sum?
I can get you the precise figures, Senator, in terms of what's been allocated. The total that's been allocated to date, Senator, does that include the extra 30 for primers? No. The total that's been allocated to date, Senator, is $289,259. And I just need to check because there's been a further decision to allocate some additional funding to one of the ISPs participating in the pilot to enable them to obtain equipment to test during the pilot a much larger load than the actual number of customers they will be dealing with. That will enable us to test what would happen if the volume of customers was scaled up significantly. There is an additional...
You're able to say which one of the trial participants?
Yes, it's Primus.
Right.
And the amount that's been allocated for that purpose is an additional $14,300 to enable Primus to undertake that additional load testing.
They'd previously been allocated $70,400 on the advice I have. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Mr. Rizzi, is it possible to table those updated figures, please?
We can do that, Senator.
Now, I understand Optus have agreed to participate, but are saying they'll do it without funding. Is that right?
They have not sought any funding to do the testing.
But it's open to them to do so at any stage, is it?
It was open for them to do so in their application. In their application, they sought no funding.
Can you indicate to us which of these participants have commenced their trials and when they are likely to conclude their trials?
Senator, they're all at various stages, as you appreciate. Yeah. Testing for 7 of the ISPs is now partly completed, and the other 2 ISPs are in the process of installing and testing their filtering solutions, inviting customers to participate and resolving details associated with the receipt and management of the ACMA blacklist.
Do you have a figure on the number of customers across these 8 participants that will be involved in the trials?
The process has involved inviting customers to participate. In total, around 30,000 customers will have been invited to participate by the 9 ISPs in total.
Do you have a view yourselves on whether that's an adequate sample base of customers in order to produce a satisfactory basis for evaluation?
Senator, there are many dimensions of the pilot test, and some of the criteria that we would test, the volume of customers is not a significant issue. In others, it is. Right. So, for example, if we are testing the accuracy of the filtering solution, that doesn't change significantly simply because the number of customers has increased. On the other hand, the issue of performance may be a different aspect. And that is why we are looking to, in addition to testing with the customers themselves, also undertaking separate load testing and scalability testing to see what the impact would be of a much larger number of customers. The other dimension to this that we are conscious of is the experience of very large ISPs in a number of overseas countries that are using very similar filtering technologies and techniques, where the number of customers they are filtering for is much larger than would be the circumstances in Australia.
It appears from the Minister's statements that the government has moved away from wanting to use the whole of the blacklist as the basis for mandatory filtering.
I'm sorry, Senator, I wasn't...
I'm happy to start again.
I'm sorry, Senator.
Yeah, that's okay. The Minister can confirm this or otherwise, but we understand from his public statements that the government has either formally or informally made a decision not to seek to have the basis for the mandatory filtering that's proposed as the whole of the ACMA blacklist, but that part of it, which is the refused classification material. Can you confirm if that's, Minister, if that's now the government policy?
The policy, which I articulated many times, was I always believed it should be targeted, and if you look at all of my public comments from when we first announced this, was at the... we talked about the ACMA blacklist, but I would always specify that this was about the child pornography and that sort of thing. What's usually often referred to as the worst of the worst. So, due to a great deal of misinformation, I've been very precise in identifying, and I think I did it at the last estimates, despite some people claiming it happened after that. I actually think I identified again at the last estimates that we would be very focused and that there was a very unambiguous case on those issues. So, yes, I can confirm exactly what I said at the last estimates, exactly what I said on Q&A and exactly what I said on Insights and many other times, that the focus of our policy has always been RC.
The RC
I refer to it now as RC in a literal sense, but I've described it previously as the child pornography, bestiality, those sorts of websites.
But it's, in terms of the list, it's the RC component. Yes. So the trial is based on that being the backbone of the filter, is it? That
the trial's based on the ACMA blacklist. It's, I think, I'm not quite sure where you're going, Senator Minchin, and often I can hazard a guess, but we're testing a range of parameters.
I want to know what these people are testing.
Well, they're testing the ACMA blacklist.
So the whole blacklist?
Yes, that was what they have been asked to test against. There's a range.
That's not what you're proposing.
No, I've just said that. There is a range of parameters. If you, Mr. Rivsey may want to take you through the parameters that we're testing again, because I'm not sure. It may actually genuinely help what you're trying to understand.
Yeah, no, I'm genuinely trying to.
We talk about 10,000. We talk about. So it doesn't matter if we're testing 1,300 or 800 or 600. We want the capacity to potentially test up to 10,000. I mean, I think that's in the actual documents that we've published. So that's been well known for some time.
That's what I'm trying to drill down on.
These are the criteria, the parameters that we're testing against. Because, as I said, we hope to be able to expand the information through international consultation with other agencies around the world that are also very active in tracking down child pornography and child sexual abuse sites. So we want a capacity to do more or less than the existing.
I see.
No, the existing number. I'm talking about a physical number now of
okay.
1,300, rather than the individual URL addresses within the 1,300.
Sorry.
Mr. Risby takes us through those criteria. The figures I asked before to be tabled gathered a slight level of confusion there, but it would be very helpful because there are a long list of figures in response to Senator Minchin that Mr. Risby was reading about the numbers involved in trials and so on and testing. If they were able to be...
Some of this information is provided to us confidentially by the companies involved. So we'll give you what we're able to, subject to commercial and confidence.
Yes, but Mr. Risby did give quite a number to Senator Minchin just before.
They're on the record, but we'll take that on notice, and any information that we can add to what's already on the record, we will provide.
Okay, Minister. It's just you appreciate having sat on this side of the table that when officers start listing off long lines of figures, sometimes
they're all on Hansard.
It's quite that doesn't help questioning today.
They're all on Hansard. You can
just
track it down within an hour if you're quick after lunch.
Yesterday's Hansard isn't up yet.
They can do rush ones if you know the system. Trust me.
Can we just so we can all proceed on the same basis. The policy is to filter for RC, but you're testing a much wider capacity for the reasons the Minister said. I accept that's the basis of the... Can you just indicate to us how and by what means you actually evaluate these trials? What are the criteria for success? How are you measuring success? And as you know, I've...
aren't they?
Yes.
And how are these trials being audited? How will the results be audited? How will you form a judgment as to whether or not to advise the government to proceed with the filter or otherwise?
I think, Senator, it's worthwhile looking at the fact that the testing is taking place at two levels. One is simply in terms of the ability of filters to block the ACMA blacklist as it currently stands, recognising that the policy is a subset of the blacklist. And secondly, to test other wider filtering services that may be commercially available or are in the process of being developed by some of these ISPs. So we're testing both.
Right.
The testing is a combination of testing through the laboratory itself, testing performance, as well as the laboratory testing the performance by playing the role of a customer, and thirdly, as part of what the customers themselves experience. The criteria that we're looking at are firstly the impact on network performance, and that is by comparing the performance when the service is unfiltered with the performance of the service when it is filtered. So that's impact on speeds. Secondly, we look at, in terms of the ACMA blacklist, the accuracy of the filter. That is, the extent to which it accurately filters the URLs identified in the blacklist. In terms of accuracy, for the wider service, we also look at both underblocking, that is, the extent to which things that should have been blocked weren't blocked, and the things and secondly also overblocking. That's in terms of the wider filtering service. The test will also look at things like circumvention techniques, that is, how easily or not easily the filter and the different filtering services can be circumvented using a range of reasonably well-known circumvention techniques. We'll look at scalability, that is, what would be the impact of running this filter on a much larger scale, and I discussed earlier some possible ways of doing that. We'll also look at issues of cost, that is, what it costs the ISP to establish such a service, and we'll also look at where the wider filtering service is provided, customer experience, that is, what experience the customers had in receiving this service, and how they dealt with it and their views on it, and that'll be through a survey that we would undertake.
Have you,
so all of this information is about informing the policy, the final policy.
Yeah,
decision.
no.
There's not an individual right. If you get X mark,
sure.
that's the outcome.
Yeah, no,
all of this
all
goes
come to a
towards
conclusion.
the
Yeah,
final policy advice.
When you say we, I mean, is the department itself the one that's measuring performance against these criteria? Have you hired some God only knows who to do this for you?
We've hired the same company you previously used.
Right.
I think that's
is
accurate.
Who's that?
NX, I think they're called.
NX Test Labs, they operate out of Monash.
They're the company that produced the famous 87% figure, for the record.
Were they simply retained, or did you have a new tender for this trial, or were they already on contract and retained from...
I think we already had them on an ongoing contract where they supply us with filtering services. Whether we went through whether we had to go through a separate new process or not, I'll just check that.
Yeah. They're used by IAA to test the PC filters as well. So.
Yeah. It was a variation of the contract that we had with them earlier to test the PC filters. That's correct.
Yeah. So they'll provide at the end of this trial period, which I'm not sure. Do you have an end date?
We're aiming for all of the testing to be completed, most likely early July.
Okay.
Some of this is sometimes out of our hands because it involves cooperation of customers, the cooperation of the ISPs. It means delivery of equipment and installation of equipment at the right time. So there's some variability as a result of that.
So at that point, what was the company? Sorry, the lab?
NX Test Lab.
NX will provide you with a report.
No, what NX Test Lab will provide are initial results from its testing.
Yep.
We will then, for each individual ISP, discuss the outcomes with that ISP to confirm with that ISP that that is an accurate reflection of the outcomes, right. And then it will be that is finally reported to the Minister.
And when would you be hoping to provide the Minister with a report?
Assuming all goes well and the testing is all completed by early July, we think, and assuming we can get responses from the ISPs quickly to the test results, we would be aiming for a report towards the end of July, early August.
Oh, and you think a month? That's all you need to assemble all this data, come to conclusions, and provide a report. And is it your intention in that late July, early August report to provide the Minister simply with the outcome or with a recommendation?
Well, the report will be an outcome of the pilot test.
Yeah, but it'll just say what the performance was against these criteria.
Correct.
Someone's then got to make a judgment, well, do we proceed or not? Will you, as part of that report, be providing advice as to whether or not you believe the government should proceed to implement its policy?
That would be.
I'm not asking for the nature of the advice, just
that would be a separate policy development process that we'd go through, Senator. And that's
so the first report will simply be, in a sense, a factual report on the outcome of the trial. Is that right?
The report. Go on. The report will be a report against those criteria and the outcomes. It will be a factual report.
And is there any intention to make that report publicly available, given that it's just a factual report on the outcome of the trial?
I think I think this question was asked. I'm not sure whether it was Senator Ludlam or Senator Birmingham at the last estimates, and we're committed to release the report.
You've committed to releasing it, right? And then on the basis of that, you will then internally provide advice as to whether to proceed or not, and you'll make a. Because I presume the government's position.
I think the government will make the decision.
Yeah, but based
on
advice.
The report.
Sure. I assume the department will be providing its own advice to you on whether it believes the report substantiates or otherwise proceeding. I'm not asking the nature of it, but I presume
it's a factual report.
Yes.
The final policy decision will be taken by the government.
Yeah, but I presume based on and with the assistance of advice of your own department.
We always base our policy decisions on advice.
I'm pleased to hear that. I'm not sure that it's always the case.
I think you'll be disappointed today, now, and disappointed later to discover that is the case.
I'm pleased to know that. I think that's all I had on
filtering at this stage, but I'm sure others
I think
have questions
Senator
on filtering.
Ludlam deserves a turn after
I
that.
suspect I probably do. Thank you.
Senator Ludlam.
Thanks, Chair. Oh, look, I'll just carry on in this vein, really. You said you'd have upward of 30,000 actual customers on board by the time, 9 ISPs are all up and running. Is that
I think
about?
I said around 30,000 would be invited to participate.
Would be invited to participate. What's the participation rate so far of actual customers?
I'd have to take that on notice, Senator. I don't have the details of that.
Okay. So one of the largest ISPs in the country, only just coming on board on the weekend, they're coming in very late in the process. Is that going to extend your timelines for reporting, or are you happy that they've joined in time to be meaningful participants?
At this stage, our advice is that they will have completed it by early July.
Okay. Of the people who've been invited and who say, yes, I'm happy to participate in the trial, is there to be a control population of people who think they're being filtered but who actually aren't?
I'm not sure this is a departmental question.
Who should I put it to?
Well, I think it's a matter of how the test is run between the NX and the actual ISP. I'm just not sure.
Well, should we see what...
I'm just not sure these are matters that we have a position on.
Well, it's not a position. I'm just asking how the test is being conducted, not a policy question.
It's been conducted.
If you're not
it's
able
been conducted by the same lab that conducted it last time, and
Yep.
it has its ways and means of conducting it. I mean, happy to take on notice the question. I'm just not sure that
I haven't heard yet whether the office
the
is happy to
government.
answer.
I'm just not sure that the government or the department has genuinely a policy on exactly the question you're asking.
Shall we see?
We will be looking at testing a filtered and an unfiltered service from the same provider, and so that enables a comparison to be made, Senator.
So there will be a control population as such?
It doesn't necessarily have to be a controlled population. It could be the same customer who receives for a period a filtered service and then for a period an unfiltered service.
Not. Okay. And how
It's a factual issue.
That's what I was after.
It's a filtered service versus an unfiltered service. It doesn't necessarily need a control group. So we don't have a policy to insist on one. So you're asking a question that we're not actually...
I was quite happy with the answer. That's fine. How will you take advice or responses from customers? Will that be through the ISP, or will they be reporting directly to the laboratory conducting the trial? So if I'm a customer, I'm being trialled and the service is very slow, what do I do? What are my obligations to report, and who do I report to?
Senator, the test will enable both NX to make those measurements using its own systems in terms of impact.
Yeah.
In terms of customers, the issue that you need to bear in mind is what is actually impacting on their internet speed, and they will not always be in a position to know whether it was the filter or it was a range of other factors.
Right.
And so I think it is better for the laboratory test to test impacts on speeds than customers. Customers will not necessarily know what is having what range of factors could be having that impact.
All right, so you're not seeking direct feedback from customers then, it's more happening between the ISP and the laboratory?
It's a factual test as opposed to an opinion.
Yep. I think it must have been maybe misreported that you dropped the idea of dynamic filtering, but obviously that's very much on the table. When you're talking about underblocking and overblocking, that's not filtering a list of URLs or DNSs, that's testing a set of categories. Is that correct? So there's two quite different sets of filtering technology being assessed here. One against a list, which turns over according to ACMA, and one, can you just maybe describe that second tier of filtering, what you're actually trialling there?
At this stage, the versions of that second group that we are testing are essentially broader categories of URLs. So a number of these filter providers divide up URLs into different sorts of categories. Some have as many as 20 and 30 categories that they use, and the individual customer is able to choose which of those categories they may or may not wish to have filtered.
Okay, so that's tailored.
Let's be clear. No one is suggesting that the mandatory filtering include dynamic.
Yeah, that's where I was going next.
It's the second tier where we've always said we want, if it's technologically possible, for parents to be offered a more robust is the wrong word, but a greater degree of capacity to block material. So, the mandatory does not include dynamic filtering.
So the mandatory side of the government's policy is where you're looking at lists that are informed by ACMA's process or by other lists down the track, perhaps?
Well, as I said, the RC list, not down the track, we've said quite clearly, because there has been much speculation, shall we say, and let's be generous to everybody involved, much speculation that we're going to be banning political content, but being generous, we're being very clear and very precise. The RC material is the mandatory material.
Only, I don't know what proportion it is, and I don't think I asked the officers from ACMA yesterday, what proportion of the current ACMA blacklist consists of RC material, but it's a subset of that list, isn't it?
I think, I'm just trying to remember what number they said. I know you asked, I'm not sure if they took it on notice.
I was asking about child pornography-related material. They said about 30%. No. But RC is a broader category, obviously, than simply the child pornography.
I think that's fair. There are different categories of RC material.
But I presume, I don't know if it's... if you're able to answer this question, but
I think 51% is RC at the moment on the 977.
Oh, you've got that in front of you.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a subset of the blacklist that's about half. Yeah. That number will change week to week as the list changes.
Yes, I think that's what the ACMA indicated yesterday.
Is the government in a position at the moment, and I don't know if you'd consider this legal advice, so you might shut me down, but is the government in a position at the moment to implement that scheme, or would that require legislative change because it's a subset of...
I think it's a subset. I'm happy to take that on notice and give you some advice on that, but because we're not changing or expanding, I'm not sure if it does, but I'm happy to get you advice on that.
Because at the moment I would have thought the regulations refer to what you can and can't do with material in the blacklist rather than a subset of that list. Would that be...
As I said, I'm happy to get advice for you on that, take that on notice.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. You mentioned yesterday, Minister, that there are some options that you're looking at, either in this trial or maybe further down the track, that are not ISP-level filtering, that there's some kind of central...
look, I wasn't trying to suggest it wasn't an ISP-level filtering. What we're talking about is whether the list needed to be promulgated.
Is resident everywhere.
And as I said, I'm aware of the New Zealand situation where they, in cooperation with the ISPs, were able to devise a system that didn't require the promulgation of the list of the individual ISPs. So I'm not sure, because that's a relatively recent development, I'm not sure whether or not that's being included in our testing.
We are testing a variant of that, Minister.
Yeah.
So there's a master blacklist resident with ACMA or on some server somewhere that ISPs refer to. Is that actually being demonstrated in New Zealand, or is that operating?
No, I think it's been demonstrated, which is why we're testing it.
It's on a commercial scale there, or on a trial scale?
Look,
they tested on a very wide scale during their pilot, and at least one ISP in New Zealand that I'm aware of is using that arrangement. Telstra Clear.
Telstra.
Okay. And they operate a central server for that arrangement out of Auckland. We've had some discussions with the New Zealand officials on how that operates, and we have decided we will send an officer from here to New Zealand shortly to discuss with them and examine how they have done how they have set up this arrangement.
Okay. And it is, sorry, just to be clear, it is part of the, as well as sending that officer, it is part of the testing regime that you're instituting here too. Are any of the ISPs involved in your trial testing technology of that sort?
One of the ISPs involved in the pilot are testing a variant of what is being done in New Zealand.
Yeah. All right, thanks. Obviously, in terms of... So in Australia for the last couple of years, or Minister, you'll tell me how long we've had the current system with the ACMA blacklist that...
01, I think it was introduced.
Okay.
2000 or 2000? 2009 years we've had the existing structure, which we still have today. There's been, as I'm sure you know,
very
no
clear
changes
very clear on that.
to the 9-year-old scheme that has been in place.
Okay, and that list has wandered up and down between the low thousands in that period of time?
Look, I'm sure we have a rough guess, but ACMA could have given you a more precise. We're happy to take it on notice if you'd like us to.
I suppose I'm just testing the idea, or asking why it is that you'd be testing a list that's 10 times the size for a mandatory block. Are we shifting away from a system? Is there a much larger proportion of material?
What we've indicated is that we want to coordinate internationally with other agencies that are engaged in the pursuit of child pedophile rings, that are involved in tracking down sites of child sexual abuse, child pornography, and we want to have the capacity, if we get more than the 900 we have, to be able to cope with that.
Is there something deficient about the list that we're keeping currently in Australia? So the IWF list, for example, I think is in the order of 10 times larger.
Sorry, I missed your first
Is there some deficiency that in Australia we're operating a list of 900 sites currently? The IWF list is at least 10 times that size. What's not on our list that's on the IWF list that you'd be concerned about wanting to filter?
Well, as I don't have an intimate knowledge of what's on our list, because it's not administered by the government, I'm not sure. I'm advised the IWF list is not as large as you're suggesting. It's only about 1,300. That's my advice, but I'm happy to be wrong. I'm not suggesting your information is inaccurate.
I'm not working from notes. I'm just working from memory. My understanding was it was a much larger list.
Yeah, no.
And obviously you're testing against a benchmark of 10,000.
Yeah, no. The 10,000 was indicated quite some considerable time ago as, at this stage of technological development, a bit of a tipping point between where you do actually impact and where you don't. So 10,000 was just an arbitrary figure based on some advice at an early stage.
That's where it gets difficult.
Well, it gets a tipping point, I think, is how it was described to us. So we are testing the New Zealand list. I'm told has 7,000 on it, to give you an indication. It is washed through, not as regularly as I would probably want ours to be washed through. So there are older URLs on the New Zealand one, but we want to be able to cope if there is more than the existing number, and 10,000 was an upper limit, which was suggested as a tipping point, and so we're testing a range of parameters within that.
Can you see where I'm heading, though, Minister?
No.
We've got a list at the moment of about 900 sites, half of which is refused classification, which the system would seek to be a mandatory block for. We're testing for a list 20 times that size. Why some concerns have been raised about the scale of the government's intentions for mandatory filtering.
Those concerns are being fuelled by deliberate misinformation by a range of people that we would be including political content.
No, I didn't mention that.
Yeah,
the scale of the list.
You talked about that there is some suggestion or some nefarious purpose.
I didn't use any of those words. Why are we testing for a list 20 times the size?
That was clearly the implication we're making. I repeat, 10,000 was picked because industry consultation suggested that was a tipping point with the use of current technology, as opposed to the previous trials, which were done some years ago, where technology wasn't as advanced. And I'm sure in a few years, in fact, one producer has even suggested to me and claimed that you could easily, without any degradation, go as high as 50,000. So that was one claim made to us, but I don't necessarily always accept every claim. But 10,000 seemed to be a reasonable consensus, so we decided to test the 10,000. There's no nefarious reason behind it. That was what industry suggested would be a reasonable one to test, which would not cause the degradation that was claimed by many people who
don't support filtering of any sort of anything at any stage.
Explain to me in entirely non-nefarious terms why the government is seeking to filter a list 20 times the size of the current RC classified material on the blacklist.
No, we're testing the capacity to.
Yeah. So why is that?
Because we want to be able to accommodate an increase if we receive information from international agencies that are focused entirely on child sexual abuse and child pornography, so that we can accommodate them.
But we have agencies. In Australia that work every day on that.
There is no intent to expand beyond the RC, despite the claims, imputations, and suggestions of many of the people who've involved themselves in this.
I'm not making any claims this morning. I'm trying to work out
morning,
why we're testing.
No, to be fair, Senator Ludlam, not this morning.
Why is the government testing for? Are we expecting
it's
an
a
influx?
Technical test,
just to see what can be done,
yes.
Just to see what's the largest scale of material we can filter.
Well, as I said to you, others who are involved in this area of technological development suggest to me that they can go much, much further. So 10,000 could be described as the current tipping point. Others would say that the tipping point is much higher, and we shouldn't believe those who claim only 10,000.
I'm less interested in the technology than the policy.
But for the purposes for a technical test, we are testing the claim that 10,000 is the tipping point.
Why?
In case, in the future, we need to have greater space than the 900 or so on the list at the moment.
Of which you're seeking to fill.
It's nothing as sinister as you keep trying to imply, and suggesting that you're not implying that is completely disingenuous of you, Senator
just
Ludlam.
Asking the questions.
You are being very disingenuous with your questions.
We're making space for something much larger to occur than currently occurs.
What are you suggesting we're planning on doing with it,
Senator Ludlam? I just wish you would tell me. Are we planning on
I'm not
expanding...
planning on doing anything more than I've said, Senator Ludlam, despite your repeated attempts to suggest otherwise.
This is starting to become a waste of the committee's time. Can you tell us when you foresee net filtering being implemented in Australia?
We're awaiting the results of the test. And until we get the results of the test, we're not in a position to give an answer.
No start date at this time?
Well, it's a little hard to give a start date until we receive the results of the test.
Well, presuming the amount of money that's being spent, leaving the dynamic stuff aside at the moment, but testing against a list, it's being done on a voluntary basis in other countries. You know, the technology is possible. The test labs come back and say you can block the blacklist. What's the program?
I appreciate that you want to speculate.
If you can help me not speculate.
Your question is a hypothetical. We've been quite consistent on this. Our policy would be evidence-based, and we would await the results of the test.
So the policy will depend on what's technically possible.
I think we've always said our policy will be evidence-based, and that's why we're conducting a trial. Why are you afraid of a trial, Senator Ludlam?
No, there's no fear here at all. It's been described by one commentator as kicking the football and then deciding where to put the goalposts. You're deciding policy based on...
On evidence?
What?
Dear, oh dear. Basing a policy on evidence, it's a terrible government fault.
Do you have an estimated ultimate cost of the trial? I'll just come back to where Senator Minchin led off from, that the 30-odd million or $28 million, I think, netted out, isn't for completion of the trial, implementation, anything like that. It's just what's left in the funding pool. That's into 2010. That's okay, so there's nothing to be read into the fact that that pile of money is sitting there in the next one.
I'm sure some could try and read it into it if they were
Tell me not to.
Duly motivated, Senator Ludlam, but I'm sure you wouldn't.
So there's no estimated ultimate cost of this scheme. It's pretty open-ended at this stage.
Well, there's a funding envelope that's in place.
Okay,
so that would define the ultimate cost potential because it's a funding envelope.
Okay. I'm just wanting to finish up, again, from some of the comments that you made yesterday when we had ACMA at the table. that you made comments earlier in the year on Insight, and you intimated something similar again yesterday, that you're considering a review of the way the blacklist is administered.
Yeah.
So we've talked entirely this morning about technology, so moving to the social and the political dimensions, consultation around that. Again, without wandering off into hypotheticals, what process can you foresee for us?
Now, look, I indicated on Insight and following some further discussions that we would consider looking at some enhanced measures for transparency. We're moving to a different system, and I think it's a fair and reasonable argument from people who are being constructive that it's possible that there should be greater accountability. Greater transparency is a little harder because, as I've always said, this is a genuine dilemma. If you're trying to deny access to sites of the kind that we've usually described. And it is a genuine dilemma. I mean, people shouldn't think that the policy debate inside the government hasn't been balancing a whole range of factors on this. So I think it's fair and reasonable that some enhanced accountability measures are put in place. I suggested, I think, on Insight that possibly decisions made by ACMA could possibly be tested by the classification board in a similar way. They actually currently do that now.
In all cases, or just in test
not
cases?
in all cases, in some that are referred.
I believe referrals to that board are actually quite expensive in the case of films and books, certainly.
Look, that may be the case. Websites of the type we're talking about are fairly well, that's being unfair. I'm prejudging, but the cost issue is a separate issue from the policy issue. I mean, they're obviously linked, but the list could be reviewed by a panel of eminent persons.
Yep.
Parliamentary committee, perhaps.
Yep.
Or, as I said, the classification board. I think all of those are fair, reasonable, constructive suggestions that people have put to me over the last couple of months to try and give a greater level of security to those who are concerned that the government may be putting the government, and not that the government is actually involved in putting things on the list, as we've described, but that unelected officials could be making decisions about what should and shouldn't be on. So I think any of those, and if you or others have got other suggestions, I'd welcome them to enhance that level of, as I said, accountability, so that people don't feel that, as I think I said this on the program, I said I'm not sure what went to air or not because I didn't actually watch it, that what we want to do is give public confidence that the list is exactly what we say it is, which is RC material.
And those comments you'd be welcoming through some sort of formal process down the track?
Look, I receive many emails on this every day.
I bet you do.
Not as many as you'd hope. But all of them are well-intentioned and raise legitimate points of policy debate. And I've received many, and I'm sure I'll receive more. But if anyone who's listening now or reads the Hansard after it's published should feel free to put forward suggestions. If their suggestions there shouldn't be any censorship, as some have put through, and I don't believe anything should be filtered on the net, well, as we said from the beginning of this debate, we'll agree to disagree. We'll agree to disagree. Not being critical, many people have the view that there should be minimal/no censorship of any form, and I think if you watch Q&A, Ms Adler sitting next to me advocated a no censorship of anything in any platform, including the internet. But we'll agree to disagree on that. But if there are suggestions that people feel can enhance public confidence in the integrity of the blacklist, then I'm open to suggestions. But I've suggested 3 there, and I don't want people to feel that they're the only 3 that might be might be available.
For the benefit of people who won't find themselves reading committee Hansard down the track, do you foresee a formal process of inviting comment on these issues, or is it an informal, just email the Minister if you feel like it? Prior to the introduction of
prior to the introduction. It's a very fair point. I'm just trying not to slow the debate. I'm actually trying just to think through how we can facilitate what you're suggesting. We could put it on the departmental website, inviting.
Well, you called for submissions
we could put out a press release. Happy to consider those issues and come back to the committee on Senator Ludlam. I think they're valuable suggestions.
I'll leave it there. Thanks, Minister, and thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Ludlam. Is there anything more on the internet filtering before we go to other issues in this program?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just wondered if, Mr Rizvi, you could just advise the committee on the options available to the government for implementing a mandatory ISP filter.
Sorry?
By what means can a government, any government, introduce mandatory ISP filtering?
I think, Senator, that would go to the nature of the advice we'd be providing.
No, it
the
doesn't.
Minister.
It's a factual question. It's a factual question.
You're asking an opinion.
I'm not asking for an opinion, Senator
I think
Conroy.
You're going beyond.
I'm asking factually. What are the options open to a government for implementing ISP filtering? It's a factual question.
Well,
just want you to elicit factually the range of options open to a government. That's not advice. I'm not asking you which option you are suggesting or might suggest to the government it pursue. I'm asking factually, for the benefit of this committee, what are the options open to a government that wanted to introduce mandatory ISP filtering?
Well, mandatory would conceivably involve legislation. Conceivably. Voluntary is available currently to ISPs, and it may come as a surprise to you, Senator Minchin, but not one ISP before this debate started had voluntary stepped up and introduced the sort of scheme we're talking about. Not one. Been available.
I don't know what on earth you're talking about, Senator Conroy.
I'm
I
talking
asked
about
what
the
the options
options
are for mandatory filtering. You've indicated to us that
potentially legislation.
Potentially
one other
option
is that it could be a voluntary basis. That they could voluntarily agree to introduce it. Unfortunately, they've shown.
I've never heard of a voluntary mandatory filter.
Well, they could agree to all introduce it.
A voluntary mandatory filter?
No, they could agree to do it.
You mean if you don't do it, we'll
unfortunately,
legislate?
No. Unfortunately,
is that what you call
unfortunately, no ISP in Australia has shown a willingness to step up to the plate, Senator Minchin, even despite your previous government looking at some of these issues. And I don't know that you are one of the 70-odd, or 69 it might have been, odd government members that signed a petition calling for it. But many on your side of politics were advocating this path because no current Australian ISP has been willing to step up and engage in this discussion.
You're justifying your policy of a mandatory filter. I understand where you're coming from, but now you're telling me that it could be a voluntary mandatory filter.
Well,
what's a voluntary mandatory filter?
No, I didn't say that. Those are your
words. Well, I asked you, what are the methods
policy
of implementing
outcome,
a mandatory filter?
The policy outcome
was apparently voluntary.
The policy outcome in terms of what, blocking the RC material could have been suggested and could be put forward by ISPs. They've chosen not to. They could all say, we all sign up on a voluntary basis
I'm aware
to block
of that.
this material.
I'm aware of that.
But unfortunately, this debate
So that's why you want a
country,
mandatory filter. I understand that's your
Yes.
policy. I'm asking for the facts as to how a government that wanted to introduce a mandatory ISP filter could do so.
Are you talking about the technical?
legislation.
Are you talking about the technical constraints?
Yes. Is it possible to do so other than by legislation?
Well, we've said that it'll be mandatory, so that's government policy.
I understand that. Well, are you indicating to this committee that were you to proceed to implement your policy, you would do it by legislation?
Look, there is actually a lively debate inside the ISP community on many issues, but on this one, there are some who believe that if we were to go down this path, it should be legislative mandatory. because some believe that not everyone, if it was voluntary, would step up to the plate, and they would.
You're missing my point. I'm wondering whether there are administrative mechanisms by which, under existing legislation,
well, that does go. I'm
or
not,
other
I'm not trying to
mechanisms.
that really does go to policy advice. If
you'd
like to get the parliamentary research to do some, do some work for you, then please do.
No, I think it's quite proper for the department to advise this committee with responsibility for this policy
the government
area
have a stated policy.
What are factually
the government have
options open to government.
The government have a stated policy, and inviting the officers to give advice about.
I'm happy if you indicate to this committee that, were you to proceed to implement your policy, you would do it by new legislation.
Well, I think I took on notice that question from Senator Ludlam and said I'd take it on notice and get back to you. I appreciate you genuinely may not have been in the room, Senator Minchin, but I actually did take that. So I'd take that on notice and come back to Senator Ludlam. So I think perhaps we've been at cross purposes here.
Right. So you're not able to say.
No, Senator Ludlam asked me would it require a legislative amendment, and I said I'd come back to him on that. Which I think actually comes off on your question.
This is my point. It may factually be possible for government to introduce this by a range of means. One might be under an existing head of legislation, one might be administrative,
it's possible, and that's
one
why
might be through new legislation.
As I said, I think
I'm happy you don't want the officers to give us those facts.
No. I've taken it on notice.
I'm happy to rely on that if you tell us that you would pursue legislation even if you had other means available to you.
What I've said is I would take that on notice. I think we've actually been at cross purposes, Senator Minchin. I think perhaps you were genuinely just out of the room for a moment and didn't hear the exchange between myself and Senator Ludlam. So I actually think we've been at cross purposes. I've undertaken to come back and give the committee some advice on that very matter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions on internet filtering? If not, other matters under program 1.2. Senator Wortley.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to move now to the issue of cyberbullying. And yesterday we heard from ACMA in relation to the establishment of helplines and some professional development programs that they spoke about. What I'm interested in pursuing today are two things. The first one being the purpose of the Youth Advisory Group.
Yes, Senator. The purpose of the group is to consider those aspects of cyber safety faced by Australian children, the views of Australian children on the nature of the cyber safety issues and risks they face, and their views on how best, from their perspective, those issues might be addressed. That would enable us to advise government on priority areas of action in the area of cyber safety.
I understand that there are 15 schools, is that correct, around Australia?
That's correct, Senator.
Participating. And they're all high schools, is that right?
They're all high schools,
yes.
Senator.
So I do. How many of the children involved, and I know that when it was announced it was stated there will be 305 involved, how many of those have accessed the online forum?
Of the 305 children that are the initial membership of the Youth Advisory Group, as at the 21st of May, 168 of them have logged on to and accessed the Youth Advisory Group online forum.
And what has been the reaction of the children to the online forum? Have you had any response from them?
They've been very positive about it. The members have posted many compliments to the site. They have applauded its purpose, its operation, its technical attributes. They're also positive about the way their advice is captured and consolidated, and then the opportunity through the use of a wiki, their ability to then refine that advice before it's finally presented to government.
So is the forum moderated? How is this done if it is?
The forum is moderated, but it is moderated after the postings are made. That is, if someone makes a posting that might be regarded as offensive, that individual would be contacted privately, and there would be a discussion about the posting and how best to deal with it.
I understand that when it was set up that part of its role was to inform government. How is this taking place?
The way we manage the site is both we, and indeed the Minister, who has personally been involved in the discussion forums online, might put up a range of topics for discussion, and the children themselves put up topics for discussion. Indeed, they put up far more topics than we've put up for discussion, and the discussion on an accepted topic by the children is then takes place, and a dialogue occurs between the children on that particular topic. We would then, at the end of that, the discussion on that topic, try to compile the views that have been expressed. Having compiled the views, we would put that up on a wiki, and the wiki is then able to be modified by the children to make sure it reflects more accurately their own views. And once there is consensus amongst the children on that wiki, that then is provided as advice to the Minister.
And in relation to that advice and what the children have put up, have there been any new ideas that have come up, or is it the information that we already
There have
know?
been some interesting ideas put up by the children, and in particular they felt they would appreciate being able to discuss directly with someone from government issues that might arise in terms of cyber safety risks privately, one-on-one, rather than necessarily have to deal with those issues either with their parents. They may feel embarrassed about talking to their parents or someone they know about the issue, but are essentially just seeking advice on how to deal with it without necessarily talking or revealing what's happened to their parents with their parents. That's been an interesting idea that's been put forward.
How did they think that could be accommodated? Would that be a central point that?